Good morning and welcome to the 27th meeting in 2019 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Can I please remind members to switch their mobiles off or at least put them on silent so they don't disturb the proceedings. The only business on the agenda today is to deal with the Referendum's Scotland Bill at Stage 2, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Government Business and Constitutional Relations, Michael Russell, and his officials to the meeting. I also welcome non-members of the Finance and Constitution to the meeting too. Members will be aware we have a considerable number of amendments to get through and groupings to consider, and I'm very mindful of the need to ensure that there is sufficient time to allow consideration of all amendments, including the later groupings. Can I therefore ask members and the Cabinet Secretary to keep their contributions as concise as possible? That being said, I now proceed to Stage 2 of the Referendum's Scotland Bill. And to begin, can I call Amendment 76 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 76 and to speak to all amendments in the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. So the first group of amendments concerns the power in Section 1 of the bill as introduced to provide for referendums. And Section 1 is extraordinary as introduced because it allows for referendums to be called either by authority of Act of this Parliament, by primary legislation, or by ministerial order or regulation, that is to say by secondary legislation. There is no equivalent power in the United Kingdom's referendums legislation, PEPERA, and the evidence that this committee took at Stage 1 from Alan Rennick of the Constitution Unit at UCL was that there is no well-functioning parliamentary democracy that gives ministers blanket authority to call a referendum by secondary legislation. This committee unanimously recommended that Section 1 of the bill is amended so that at least constitutional referendums must require primary legislation and that all other referendums will ordinarily require primary legislation. Now, I want to speak not only to Amendment 76, which is the lead amendment in this group, but also and principally actually to Amendment 1. Amendment 1 omits Section 1 from the bill and replaces it with a provision that would mean that any referendum to which this Act applies, to which this bill applies, would need to be triggered by an Act of the Scottish Parliament. And I note that that amendment is now supported by the Cabinet Secretary, and I very much welcome his support for it. And what that would mean is that this bill would be identical to the UK equivalent legislation, PEPERA, in that any referendum held on a devolved matter within Scotland to which this Act would apply would require an Act of the Scottish Parliament to establish it. That is the clearest and simplest solution, I think, to the problem that Section 1 as introduced posed. And as I say, I very much welcome the government's apparent support for it. Amendments 76 and 77 are alternatives to Amendment 1 in the event that Amendment 1 isn't accepted by the committee. So Amendment 76 would mean that any referendum on a constitutional matter would require an Act of the Scottish Parliament. And Amendment 77 would mean that any referendum on a moral issue would also require an Act of the Scottish Parliament. That's to say that no constitutional referendum and no referendum on a moral issue could be called by ministerial order or regulation. I don't intend to press either of those amendments to a vote, Convener, if Amendment 1 if the indication is from members of the committee that Amendment 1 is likely to be accepted. 76 and 77 are lesser alternatives to Amendment 1, not designed to be pressed in addition to Amendment 1 if Amendment 1 is indeed accepted. Briefly, if I can turn to the other amendments in this group, I think the other amendments in this group are all consequential on Amendment 1. There are two rival amendments to Section 2. These are Amendments 2 and 3. The Cabinet Secretary proposes to leave out Section 2 entirely because I think his well, he'll be able to speak for himself in a moment, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think the understanding is that Section 2 becomes unnecessary or odious if Amendment 1 is accepted. And I would happily support that amendment. My amendment to Section 2 simply omits from it the provision that would enable regulations under the provision to modify any enactment. And the reason why I lodged that amendment, Convener, is because we took evidence, this committee took evidence from the Law Society of Scotland that aspect of Section 2 as introduced was too broad and gave ministers too great a degree of power to amend primary legislation by secondary legislation, which is always something that we should be alive to. But again, I won't press Amendment 2 if Amendment 3 is pressed and accepted by the if Amendment 3 is pressed by the Cabinet Secretary and accepted by the committee, because I prefer Amendment 3, which leaves out the entirety of Section 2, to Amendment 2, which leaves out only 3 words of it. And all of the other amendments, as I've already said, I think, in this group are consequential on Amendment 1. All of them are in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and we will support all of those, except for one, Amendment 78, which is in my name, which we think is one further aspect of the legislation which would require to be amended in the event that the ministerial power to trigger referendums by regulations is removed from Section 1. And that simply omits the words in brackets, including this Act, from Section 3, subsection 1A. And all that would mean is that the provisions in Section 3 regarding referendum questions would apply where provision is made by or under an Act of the Scottish Parliament for the holding of a referendum. We don't need the words including this Act in that sentence, because no referendum is to be held under this referendum. This bill does not contain provision for the holding of any particular referendum, so we don't need those words in that section, and it's neater, I think, and cleaner, more accurate simply to omit them. That's the force of Section 78. And as I said, all of the other amendments in this group in the name of the Cabinet Secretary are ones that we would be happy to support.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 3 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. And at the outset, can I say that it is always my approach to a bill, as members of this committee know, because we've been in these positions before, to seek to enhance the bill and to reach agreement on issues that have been raised in the committee report. And that has lain behind all the approaches that I've taken to amendments today, as I hope will become clear. And I hope at the end of this second stage of the bill, we can have a clear agreement on the bill, and that the bill then is clear whether people wish to support the bill or oppose the bill, but we've sorted out the issues that have been raised at stage 1. I do believe and still believe that this bill was a different approach, and there are elements of it that will survive this process, to arranging referendums. It provided the framework which would then bolt on the specific arrangements for a referenda, which is a different approach from that to PEPERA. However, some members of the committee prefer the PEPERA approach, and therefore I'm trying to find a way to ensure that the objections to that were raised at stage 1 in evidence and also by the committee can be met. So that's the background to where I find myself this morning. The committee heard evidence on whether referendums should be triggered by primary or secondary legislation and which circumstances these would be appropriate. And your stage 1 report recommended that the bill be amended so referendums on constitutional issues must require primary legislation. All other referendums would ordinarily require primary legislation too. And that if the government wished to specify specific criteria for other referendums, then we should bring that forward. Now, as I said out in the stage 1 debate, I've accepted the argument that most referendums should be triggered by primary legislation. And I've gone on to consider whether there are circumstances in which a referendum could be provided by secondary legislation subject to some form of super-affirmative procedure. Of course, I brought in evidence to the committee when I spoke to the committee on these matters and was questioned by the committee, circumstances where it does apply, for example, in New Zealand. But having taken account of the evidence and the view of the committee, I've come to the conclusion it would be best to not to stand upon that issue and to try and find a way to meet the objections of the committee. So Adam Tompkins has lodged Amendment 1 to the effect that would produce the effect of making sure that all referenda are undertaken by primary legislation. I intended to lodge my own amendment to make the same change, but I was slightly tardy in that matter, so I put my name to his amendment and I support it and would encourage the committee to support it. Mr Tompkins has indicated that 76 and 77 are alternatives to that approach, and as I have accepted Amendment 1, which is a better approach, then I don't think there's any need to proceed with 76 and 77, and I'm grateful to Mr Tompkins for having made that clear in what he has said. They don't address the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee recommendations that the procedure should be adjusted for secondary legislation. So I think we should simply park those and accept that Amendment 1 is the right way to do it. I have lodged consequential amendments 23, 29, 42, 49 and 61, which make the necessary consequential adjustments to the bill to accommodate the changes to Section 1, and those would essentially provide the full job if added to Section 1. Mr Tompkins has referred to Amendment 78 as a change to Section 3 as a consequence of Amendment 1. I support that amendment and will encourage others to do so. In addition, Mr Tompkins lodged Amendment 2 to make changes to Section 2. That would remove the power to amend enactments. I have been more radical than Mr Tompkins in this matter, and Amendment 3 in my name would remove Section 2 altogether. If Section 1 provides for a bill in all cases, any necessary adjustments to the provisions in the framework could be done in a subsequent bill as is common. That's a more straightforward approach than Section 2. And Amendment 18 removes a superfluous reference to Section 2 if Amendment 3 is accepted.
Thank you. Any other member wish to contribute? In that case, I don't... Oh, sorry, Patrick, I didn't see you there. Patrick Harvey.
Thanks very much. Just to say that, like others, we've debated the question about whether specific legislation should always be required for referendums in the future, and I was willing, with an open mind, to allow the Cabinet Secretary to come back if he wanted to set out criteria which would allow for secondary legislation to be adequate. I was never really convinced that the need was there. It seems to me that we would have a referendum on an issue that was so big an issue that it transcends the parliamentary process, or so contentious an issue that it wasn't appropriate for Parliament to deal with it. And it's always struck me as difficult to envisage a situation where an issue would meet those tests and yet be so simple that it doesn't require the detailed scrutiny that full legislation would offer. So I'm glad that a compromise or an agreement has been reached, and the Cabinet Secretary has agreed that, that this change can be made. I had to say that even if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't be agreeing to 76 and 77 from Adam Tompkins if they were to be moved. If a minor matter was constitutional, I don't see that as being particularly key to the test of whether primary legislation is necessary. And as for a moral issue, as we've discussed previously in the committee, I don't see it easily possible to have a clear definition of what constitutes a moral issue. All too often in politics, we regard things as moral issues when they affect marginalised people rather than what the moral content of the arguments are. Women's reproductive rights are often seen as moral issues. Men's reproductive rights never are. Same-sex relationships, family law is often seen as a moral issue. Mixed-sex relationships, people's family law never is. So I wouldn't be agreeing to 77 on a point of principle. And I think the idea that we have legislation that separates out what are seen as moral issues in politics and what are not would be a fundamental mistake.
Okay, any other member wish to have a contribution? In that case, Adam Tompkins, to wind up and just to confirm whether you wish to press or withdraw Amendment 76, please.
Thank you, Convener. As I've already said, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's support for Amendment 1, and in the light of that, and in the expectation that the committee will vote for it, I won't press 76.
I still require to ask, does any member object to Amendment 76 being withdrawn? No member objects. I therefore call Amendment 77 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated Amendment 76. Adam Tompkins to move or not move?
Not moved.
I therefore call Amendment 1 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated with Amendment 76. Adam Tompkins to move or not move?
Move.
The question, therefore, is that Amendment 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. The question is that Section 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I now call Amendment 2 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated with Amendment 76. Adam Tompkins to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 76. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. I call Amendment 78 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated with Amendment 76. Adam Tompkins to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 78 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 79 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with Amendments 90, 91 and 92. Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 79 and speak to all amendments in the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The second, I think, fairly significant area of contention generated by this bill as introduced is on the Electoral Commission's role in testing the intelligibility of questions. And in particular, the provision in Section 3, subsection 7 of the bill that would bypass that function of the Electoral Commission for referendums that are essentially repeat referendums. And the committee took very strong evidence on this matter at stage 1, including, of course, from the Electoral Commission itself, who said this: they firmly recommend that it must be required, that it, the Electoral Commission, must be required to provide views and advice to the Scottish Parliament on the wording of any referendum question, regardless of whether we, the Electoral Commission, have previously published our views on the proposed wording. That was the evidence that we got from the Electoral Commission, and I don't think anybody, apart from the Cabinet Secretary, demurred from that evidence, so that when we came to reach our conclusions as a committee on this matter, we unanimously recommended that the Cabinet Secretary must recognise the weight of evidence on this issue in favour of the Electoral Commission testing a previously used referendum question. And we said the Cabinet Secretary must come to an agreement based on this evidence with the Electoral Commission prior to stage 2. And it's unfortunate, I think, that the evidence we have in front of us for stage 2 would indicate that no such agreement has been reached. The Cabinet Secretary wrote to the convener last week about this matter, indicating only that the Electoral Commission are aware of the amendments in this group in the Cabinet Secretary's name, not that the Electoral Commission have agreed to them. Indeed, in the Electoral Commission's briefing on stage 2, the Electoral Commission say this, that their primary concern, again I'm quoting from the Electoral Commission, the Electoral Commission's primary concern is that Parliament is able to access the Commission's independent advice on the intelligibility of a proposed referendum question at any point it requests it, regardless of whether a question has been asked within that parliamentary session. That's the Electoral Commission's view. It's as strong and as unambiguous as it was at stage 1. So the committee at stage 2, it seems to me, convener has 3 options available to it, right? The first option is not to amend Section 3 at all, and for Section 3 to go on to stage 3 unamended, so that the Electoral Commission will effectively be bypassed with regard to any referendum that has previously been used. That is what will happen if we do not amend stage 3 today, Section 3 today. The second option is to accept the Cabinet Secretary's amendments, which do not have the agreement of the Electoral Commission, or at least we have not been told that they have the agreement of the Cabinet Secretary. I'm very happy, the Cabinet Secretary is shaking his head, I'm very happy to take an intervention from him if he wants to
Is that on page 2?
Clarify that.
On page 2 of the Electoral Commission's note for this meeting, Electoral Commission briefing, it says, the Commission has had a constructive meeting with the Cabinet Secretary to discuss Amendments 90, 91 and 92 relating to the Commission's role in any question assessment. We're continuing to discuss the finer detail with officials to ensure that final legislation reflects the principle outlined above. I don't think that is anything other than an accurate assessment of where we are, but it does not indicate a rejection of this, which is what you're implying.
I very much welcome the fact that there clearly has been constructive engagement between your office, Cabinet Secretary, and the Electoral Commission. I very much welcome that. But unfortunately, I wish it were otherwise, but unfortunately, the evidence that we have in front of us today does not allow us to reach the conclusion that constructive engagement, welcome as it has been, has led to an agreement between yourself and the Electoral Commission. And that is what this committee unanimously called for in our Stage 1 report. We unanimously said that there must be an agreement between the government and the Electoral Commission about the Electoral Commission's role with regard to the testing of referendum questions where those questions have previously been used. And we have no evidence that there is such an agreement. All we have been told is that the Electoral Commission are aware of your view. Those are the words that you used in your letter to the convener last week, and the Electoral Commission have said that their primary concern with this bill, as it stands, is that Parliament must be able to access the Commission's independent advice on the intelligibility of a proposed referendum question at any point it requests it, regardless of whether a question has been asked within that parliamentary session. Now, the amendments in this group, in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, do not give effect to that concern. They do not give effect to the view, very strong and unambiguous and clear view of the Electoral Commission, that any referendum question must be tested for its intelligibility by the Electoral Commission, irrespective of whether that referendum question has been used before. The only amendment in this group that gives effect both to the force of the Electoral Commission's evidence, both at Stage 1 and now, and indeed the only amendment that gives effect to this committee's unanimous recommendation in our Stage 1 report, is the amendment in my name, Amendment 79. And the force of Amendment 79 would clarify that for the avoidance of doubt, the Electoral Commission's functions, statutory functions, as an independent scrutineer of the intelligibility of referendum questions must apply even if a referendum question has already been used. That amendment gives effect to the overwhelming force of the evidence that we received at Stage 1. It gives effect to the views of the Electoral Commission at both Stage 1 and Stage 2, and it is the only course available to the committee today. Of course, it can always be revisited at Stage 3, but it is the only course available, convener, to the committee today that gives effect to the unanimous recommendation of this committee at paragraph 72 of our Stage 1 report. And so for that reason, I urge members of the committee to support Amendment 79 and to reject Amendments 90, 91 and 92 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. As I said, I welcome the fact that there has been constructive engagement between Mr. Russell's office and the Electoral Commission, but I regret the fact that that constructive engagement has not yet led to an agreement between the government and the Electoral Commission about this issue.
Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 90 and other amendments in the group, please.
Convener, we've heard from Adam Tompkinson why he believes that my amendment should be rejected and his should be accepted. I have the opposite point of view, and I shall make the case for the opposite point of view. I have to say, to deal with his amendment to start with, it makes what you might call an inelegant change to Section 3.7 to prevent any reuse already tested referendum questions at all. I believe that's illogical. I also believe it's impractical. And I think that the amendment is a curious way of achieving the aims he has set out. So I don't think, even in drafting terms, Amendment 79 fulfills his objectives. But question testing has been at the heart of the debate about this bill. Now, I've heard the evidence that's been presented on this subject, the arguments put forward by this and the Delegated Powers Committee. But I also believe there is other evidence, and I brought that evidence to this committee, not least the absolute clarity of the evidence that exists in the poll by Progress Scotland, which shows how well understood the question is, and the fact that it has been used so regularly that there is a very strong case for saying that a question should have a shelf life, and that that shelf life should be determined, at least in part, by the way in which that question continues to be used. Now, in stage 1 report, the committee recommended I consider the evidence and come to an agreement with the Electoral Commission. And I have taken that very seriously. And I have spoken with the Commission, I have met with the Commission, there have been frequent debates and discussions between officials and the Commission. And I met with the Commission last week and wrote to the committee to provide an update on progress on the matter. And we continue to have constructive discussions, and Amendments 90 and 92 are not abstract in that regard, they are concrete examples of that discussion that has moved very far along the line. And taken together, these amendments would mean that a referendum question on which the Election Commission, as previously reported, would have a limited life, and indeed, in the case of the question that it was cast in 2014, would already have expired. And the decision about whether it could be reused would be one for the Parliament to make, and it would be one that would require the input of the Electoral Commission. So this would mean that the question would be available for a reuse, but it would be, although initiated by Scottish ministers, it would be decided by the Parliament. And that is the right way to move forward. Before lodging any motion to reuse it, ministers would have to consult the Electoral Commission. At the same time as lodging the motion, we would have to give details of the consultation with the Electoral Commission and set out why they think this extended validity period should apply or not. And if the Parliament refused to agree to the question, that would be the end of the matter. Yes, of course.
Clarity of his remarks. It may well be that there are some things about referendums that we don't do very well yet in the United Kingdom. But one of the things that we do well is the three-way relationship between ministers, the Electoral Commission, and the Parliament that legislates to authorise or trigger a particular referendum. And the roles of each are clear and distinct. It is the role of ministers to propose referendum questions. It is the role of the independent statutory Electoral Commission to test the intelligibility of a proposed referendum question in order to ensure that the interests of voters are paramount and that there is no inadvertent confusion in the question which is proposed to be put to voters. That's the function of the Electoral Commission, to represent and put first the interests of voters. And it is then the function of Parliament, whether it's the UK Parliament or under this bill, this Parliament, to legislate accordingly. Now, that's all I'm asking for. Now, what the Minister is proposing is very close to that, but it isn't quite that. So what is his reason for wanting to pull back from that very clearly established and well-functioning three-way relationship between ministers, the Commission, and the Parliament?
I would want to disagree with your definition, and I would do so in the words of the Electoral Commission. When given evidence at stage 1 to this committee, the Electoral Commission made clear to the committee that it saw its role, this is the words of evidence, as advising rather than binding government. And this is a quote, "It is reluctant to step into a space that is for members, for Parliament, and for political viewpoints." Now, what I am proposing here is exactly that. The decision, the final decision, will lie with the members of this Parliament. But the Electoral Commission will advise and its view will be heard. And the Electoral Commission has not rejected this position. This is an ongoing discussion. They have indicated that to members of this committee, saying they're discussing the finer detail with officials to ensure that the final legislation reflects the principle outlined above. So that discussion will continue and may well bear fruit at stage 3. But in actual fact, to refuse to accept this progress actually goes against what the Commission itself is saying about its role. This reflects, in my view, exactly what that role is, because it does bring in the role of the Commission to advise, but it gives the final decision to members, which is exactly what it should be. And therefore, I want to conclude, convener, because I know you're looking anxious in terms of the time. What I want to conclude is to say that I believe this does meet exactly the requirements of the committee. And I think 90 to 92 should be accepted.
Point of information, convener.
Sorry.
Point of information.
You have an opportunity in wind up.
Point of information, convener.
I believe, and I've used those words, I believe this meets exactly the requirements of the committee, and I'm asking the committee to support it with the provision that, of course, if there is further change to come with those discussions with the Commission, then I am happy to come back to the committee at stage 3. Because the Commission says the discussion hasn't concluded, and in those circumstances, as the discussion concludes, I'm happy to come back at stage 3. But this takes us on and is a major concession from the Scottish Government, and I think it should be recognised as such.
John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, convener. I mean, I have to say I disagree primarily with the comments that Adam Tompkins made about, you know, there is only one course available to the committee. I mean, that's obviously a political statement, but no, I mean, the reality is there are several courses available to the committee. I mean, I think it's disappointing that when we did say in our report must come to an agreement prior to stage 2, that hasn't finally happened. I accept that we have moved, or the government and the Commission have moved a considerable way in that direction, but haven't maybe quite got to the conclusion. So the reality is, how do we react to that? We have got a couple of choices, I think, at least, as to which amendments we accept. But you know, fundamentally, I do not accept the argument that there's only one course available to the committee consistent with our report. I absolutely do not agree with. I mean, I don't think we want to be in the position where the Electoral Commission, the word bind was used, you know, can dictate to Parliament. It would seem to me that is going rather too far in respecting their position. We're clearly in quite a subject. Yes,
there is no amendment on the table that would allow the Electoral Commission to bind Parliament. The Electoral Commission's role is to the Electoral Commission's role under Papira and the Electoral Commission's role under my amendment would be to independently test the intelligibility of referendum questions. It will then be for this Parliament to decide whether to accept or reject the Electoral Commission's advice. So the idea that the Electoral Commission is being able to bind Parliament is just not accurate.
Well, I mean, that's exactly my point, that the Electoral Commission should not be able to bind Parliament, and it appears, I mean, the suggestion is here, at least almost, that we're trying to get to a position where they would. Well, that is, appears to be the case. The point is that Parliament, as I understand it in these amendments, which I think is a kind of compromise amendment, putting a time limit on how often a question has to be assessed, is a reasonable compromise. And I think it is a fairly subjective area, so I don't think we're talking black and white here. We're talking opinion, we're talking judgment, all of these kind of things. So I think on that basis, I certainly am positive about the compromise that we have these time limits, with the proviso that if, as the Electoral Commission said, they're discussing finer details with officials, then that could be further amended at stage 3.
Thank you. Alec Rowley.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been an agreement reached with the Electoral Commission, so the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, has failed to get that. I still don't know why he is so insistent in this area and not being able to find a way to bringing people together, but he's clearly failed to do that. Therefore, I will support the Amendment 79 in the name of Adam Tompkins. Let's see by stage 3 whether we can get this. It's not about compromise, it's about getting the best way forward, built on best practice, and the evidence was quite overwhelming against what the Minister and the Government was proposing. So I really think, you know, you could perhaps use your votes to force this through, but it's not a really good start to an agenda that you claim is about trying to bring people together. So I certainly will be voting against the Minister's amendments and supporting the amendment in the name of Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Alec Rowley. Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you. I'm sorry that the tone of this debate so far has been, I think, a bit a bit needlessly confrontational. Adam Tompkins has recognised that what the Minister is offering is very nearly, but in his view not quite, what he thinks is necessary. And the Minister has recognised that this is substantial progress, but not the last word, and that it could be returned to at stage 3. So, you know, there's perhaps a little bit of performative oppositionalism here, but I think actually people are moving somewhat together to something that should be recognised as acceptable. And I also think that this discussion, there have been these two big contentious issues around primary or secondary legislation and question testing. This discussion on question testing is now changed because of the amendments that we've just agreed to on primary and secondary legislation. Any referendum that takes place in the future under the framework of this bill will itself be subject to primary legislation, amendable in Parliament. And Parliament will be entirely capable, if it chooses to, of saying we think the government of the day is trying to pull a fast one and get around question testing. So we'll put in an amendment to the specific referendum bill that ensures that question testing happens. So it seems to me that we're already in a position, even regardless of these amendments, where the Electoral Commission's primary concern that Parliament is able to access the Commission's independent advice on the intelligibility of a proposed referendum question at any point it requests it, we're already in that position because of the amendments we passed on primary legislation for future referendums. I think the amendments 90 to 92 in the Minister's name go somewhat further to achieving an additional safeguard, an additional reassurance for Parliament that we'll be able to make the relevant decisions at the time we wish to, or any subsequent Parliament wishes to. And if there's still scope for the Minister to come back and discuss further refinements at stage 3, I think that would be a positive thing as well. But I do think that we're very much closer together on this than some people seem to be presenting.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Just to comment briefly on this debate around these various amendments. When the committee produced its Stage 1 report, it resolved unanimously that the Scottish Government and Electoral Commission must come to an agreement around this whole question of testing of a previously used question. And it is clear from what the Cabinet Secretary has said, although I recognise there has been progress and movement and discussions, that right at this moment there has not been an agreement reached. And no doubt you will correct me if that's an incorrect interpretation, but I think that's where we are. Discussions have been happening, progress has been made, but we have not actually reached an agreement. Therefore, that very strong, unanimous recommendation of the committee at stage 1 has not, at this point, been met. And therefore, I think the kindest thing we can say about amendments 90, 91 and 92 is that they are premature. They are putting the cart before the horse, because we do not, at this point, have an agreement with the Electoral Commission. And for the Cabinet Secretary to put forward these amendments stating what he wants the position to be when there has not been agreement with the Electoral Commission, I think is pushing the boat out too far. And therefore, there's a very simple way of dealing with this, which is there's still an opportunity, there's another round at stage 3 for the bill to be amended. In a spirit of openness and compromise, I would recommend to the Cabinet Secretary he does not press his amendments 90, 91 and 92. As and when agreement is then reached with the Electoral Commission, if that then occurs, the Electoral Commission come and tell us, and he will tell us what that agreement is, and at that point, at stage 3, amendments are brought forward to seek to implement that agreement when it is reached. But to bring forward these amendments now, when no agreement has been reached, which simply represent the Cabinet Secretary's view on the way forward, is inappropriate and not meeting the spirit or indeed the letter of what this committee resolved at stage 1.
Thank you. Angela Constance.
Thanks, Convener. Obviously, later on in stage 2, we will indeed, in Group 17, debate the pros and cons of whether ministers should have a duty to follow the advice from the Electoral Commission. But in terms of the group in front of us, I think there are two important factors. One is how we move matters forward, and also how we protect the role of Parliament. And I think the tenor of at least the earlier debate confirmed my fears around Amendment 79, that it really was about taking issues backward. It was a step backwards as opposed to taking a step forward. And amendments 90 to 92, I think, are a serious attempt by the Cabinet Secretary to take matters forward in line with the committee's aspirations as detailed in our Stage 1 report. Obviously, there is continuing opportunity for dialogue in advance of Stage 3, but I think committee can take some heart from the correspondence from the Electoral Commission themselves when they say we are continuing to discuss the finer detail with officials to ensure that the final legislation reflects the principles outlined above. There are some substantial reassurances in the amendments. Ministers must consult with the Electoral Commission, but the bottom line for me at the end of the day is that these matters should rest with our Parliament, not with ministers, and not with unelected bodies either, as acknowledged by the Electoral Commission themselves.
Gordon MacDonald, thank you.
Just a brief point. The Labour Party manifesto for the forthcoming election is a key policy that will hold a referendum on the deal within 6 months. So, you know, given the timescales involved in that, and we're always told that the UK Parliament is sovereign, does that not suggest that the position that the Cabinet Secretary is putting across is that it's going to be in the hands of members of the UK Parliament to decide whether there's any testing involved, or whether the question that was used in 2016 will be used again? Or is it going to create an uneven playing field in how questions are used for referenda across the UK?
Okay, Alec Burnett.
Thank you, Convener. Just in response to Patrick Harvey's comments, I just wonder whether he contended, I heard what he was saying, but under changes to Section 1, the Parliament could add the role to the Electoral Commission in analysing the question. I just wondered if you would also agree that the reverse could also occur, in that, under Section 1, the role of the Electoral Commission's role could also be removed if that was the wish as well, and whether the de facto inclusion of the Electoral Commission would be a more satisfactory position. Yes, certainly. Yeah.
An intervention?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly clear to all of us that legislation can always be amended. This Parliament can't pass legislation which is then unamendable by a subsequent Parliament. So if there was this bill was passed and became an act, and we had a future bill setting up a referendum, that bill itself could amend this act in any direction. I hope that we'll never have a Parliament that would seek to abolish or unreasonably restrict the impartiality or the role of impartial bodies. And I've publicly urged the government to be a bit more relaxed about the role of the Electoral Commission during the Stage 1 debate. But as a simple matter of fact, yes, any subsequent bill could amend the bill that we're discussing today.
Yeah, thank you for that intervention, which I agree with. I just wonder why he wouldn't also agree that it would be a better starting point to include the Electoral Commission than not.
Okay, no other member wanting to take part? In that case, Adam Tompkins to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 79, please.
I thank all the members and the Minister for their contributions to the debate in this group. I think it's one of the most, there's no unimportant group, but this is one of the most important issues raised by the bill. And the reason why it's important is because referendums decide things, and they decide big things, things that matter, things that change the entire nation. And it is surely something that we should all want to agree with, that the ground rules for setting up referendums must be unimpeachable. The First Minister herself has referred to the 2014 independence referendum as the gold standard. And the Edinburgh Agreement was an important part of that, the Edinburgh Agreement which the First Minister herself signed. And there is a lingering suspicion that seeking to bypass the independent statutory function of the Electoral Commission, or seeking to minimise the independent statutory function of the Electoral Commission is rigging the rules of a future referendum. There is, as I said in my intervention to the Minister, a very clear three-way relationship, which I think has been slightly, or more than slightly, mischaracterised by Mr Mason and Ms Constance in their remarks today. Ministers propose referendum questions. The Electoral Commission independently tests the intelligibility of those questions, and then Parliament decides. And that should happen for every referendum in the United Kingdom or in any part of the United Kingdom. That is the effect of my amendment. There is nothing in my amendment that seeks to bind this or any other future Parliament to accept the recommendations of, to accept the recommendations of the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission advises, and my point, Minister, is that the Electoral Commission should be able to give that advice with regard to each and every referendum we hold, irrespective of whether we have previously held a referendum on that question. Happy to give way.
I just want to take up Mr Fraser's point with you. If my amendments are, as Mr Fraser says, premature, is your amendment not also premature? Given that your argument is that I have not reached agreement, my argument is I've made progress in reaching agreement, I'm reflecting that. Your amendment doesn't reflect on any progress made at all. It is contrary indeed to what the Commission itself is saying in its report in terms of continuing to discuss the finer detail. No. So would you accept that your amendment should be withdrawn as premature in the argument Mr Fraser's had? No, I wouldn't. And I'm coming on to that point. The evidence that we received from the Electoral Commission at stage 1, Mr Russell, was clear and unambiguous. And that clear and unambiguous evidence was that the Electoral Commission's role as an independent scrutineer of the intelligibility of referendum questions must be protected and must be employed for every referendum held in the United Kingdom or in any part of the United Kingdom. And that is the force of my amendment. My amendment would require that the Electoral Commission's role with regard to the intelligibility of question testing is maintained for every referendum. That is the advice that we were given by the Electoral Commission. That's the evidence that we were given by the Electoral Commission, and nobody in evidence to this committee, except for you, Cabinet Secretary, nobody in evidence to this committee contradicted or countermanded that advice at all. So my amendment is not premature. My advice is seeking to give full effect to the full weight of the evidence that we received at stage 1. In our stage 1 report, Convener, we unanimously concluded that the Cabinet Secretary must come to an agreement based on all of that evidence with the Electoral Commission prior to stage 2. Not prior to royal assent, not prior to stage 3, but prior to stage 2. And the fact is, notwithstanding the fact that we all welcome the constructive engagement that the Cabinet Secretary has had with the Electoral Commission, that agreement has not been reached, and here we are at stage 2. So I'm afraid that amendments 90 to 92 in the name of Mr Russell are both inappropriate and premature, and that the only course available to the committee today that gives effect, I will give away, the only course available to the committee today that gives effect to what this committee unanimously recommended at stage 1 is to accept Amendment 79 and to reject the other amendments in this group. Happy to give way to Mr Mason.
Is the member arguing that time is not a factor at all in this, and that whether a question was asked a day ago, a year ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, just doesn't matter at all?
I am arguing that, yeah, because I think it's preposterous to imagine that we would hold a referendum on a question the day after we had previously held a referendum on a matter. I mean, referendums are not going to be held on matters, no matter how important they are, in that kind of timescale, Mr Mason. It's a fanciful and rather ludicrous example. Referendums are held in the United Kingdom on important matters of constitutional change. They might, I mean, that's not, they might also be held on other issues, but as Mr Harvey said in his earlier remarks, it is difficult to conceive of an issue that is important enough to be held to be decided by referendum, which isn't somehow important. So, it seems to me elemental that when we hold referendums, we want to hold them to the highest possible standard. And a key element of that gold standard is that ministers propose referendum questions. The Electoral Commission independently tests the intelligibility of those referendum questions, putting the interests of voters first, and then Parliament decides whether to accept or to reject the independent advice of the Electoral Commission. And all my amendment seeks to do is to ensure that any future referendum on any subject, whether it's Scottish independence or anything else, that any future referendum held under the authority of this Act or of this bill meets that gold standard. That's all I'm seeking to achieve in Amendment 79, and the Cabinet Secretary's amendments do not reach that gold standard. They fall short of that gold standard, and for that reason they should be rejected.
Thank you. Therefore, the question is that Amendment 79 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
In that case, there will be a division. All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. All those who abstain. There were 5 votes for, 6 against. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I therefore call Amendment 90 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 79, ask the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 90 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
There will be a division. All those in favour, please show. All these against. Thank you. Any abstentions? Those for 6, those against. The amendment is therefore agreed to. I call Amendment 91 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 79, and I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 91 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
There will be a division. All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. And any abstentions? 6 votes for, 5 against. The amendment is therefore agreed to. I now call Amendment 92 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 79. I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question therefore is Amendment 92 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
There will be division. Therefore, those in favour, please show. Those against, please show. And those who wish to abstain. There were 6 votes for, 5 against. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The question is that Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
Your dissent is noted. Call Amendment 4 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with Amendments 4A and 75. Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 4 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. The Electoral Commission, of whom we've heard so much already this morning, made the following recommendation in their September 2016 report on the 2016 EU referendum. It's recommendation 3 on page 11 of that report. And the Electoral Commission says this, that the starting assumption for governments and legislatures should be that referendums are... Sorry, I'm on the wrong page. I'm on the wrong section. Give me a second.
So,
Amendment 4 on minimum regulated period.
Yeah, correct.
Sorry,
Okay,
sorry,
take your
time. Right, okay, let's start that again. I don't think there's going to be a disagreement between the Cabinet Secretary and me on this issue, because I think that the force of my Amendment 4 and the force of his Amendment 75 are broadly similar. And that is that the bill should be amended in one way or another, and I think his Amendment 75 and my Amendment 4 are 2 different means of achieving the same ends. That the bill should be amended in one way or another to ensure that the minimum regulated period for any referendum held under the authority of this Act is 10 weeks. As introduced this bill had no minimum referendum period, and the committee took evidence, I think, that there should be a minimum period, and that the best practice appeared to be that a minimum of 10 weeks should be adopted. And as I am happy to be corrected, but as I understand it, the force of his Amendment 75 and the force of my Amendment 4 are two different legislative means of seeking the same result. I am not going to die in a ditch about whether the means adopted by Amendment 4 in my name or the means adopted in Amendment 75 in his name should be taken. I think his Amendment 75, which simply defines a referendum period in the schedule of definitions, is probably more elegant and neater than the alternative. So I'd be very happy not to press Amendment 4 if he wishes to press Amendment 75, unless he thinks that there is some material difference between the force of my amendment and the force of his amendment, which I have overlooked in my sleepiness. Jackie Bailey has an amendment to my amendment which would make the minimum regulated period 12 weeks rather than 10. The selection of any period is, I suppose, arbitrary, but the question I would have for Jackie Bailey is why 12, when the evidence that the committee took was that 10 weeks was the minimum that was required. There wasn't any discussion, I think, in any of our evidence taking of a 12-week period, but there was quite a lot of discussion in our evidence taking of a 10-week period. And this committee, there are recent unfortunate exceptions to this, but this committee, by and large, seeks to follow the evidence. And the evidence is that the minimum regulated period should be 10 weeks. And so I would stick at 10 and not extend to 12. But again, this is not a ditch in which I propose to die.
Jackie Bailey to move Amendment 4 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener, and let me add to the breaking consensus, because I think there is broad support for the principle that the length of the regulated referendum period should be set out in the bill. I am conscious, though, that if Adam Tompkins withdraws Amendment 4, then Amendment 4A has nothing on which to hook itself. So I'm slightly disappointed that he's prepared to cave for the Cabinet Secretary's formulation of words when his is clearly far superior. But that said, I was challenged to say why 12. And I do think, and you said so yourself in previous debates around amendments, that these are momentous decisions that could be taken in future referenda. And I suppose, not just reflecting on the evidence you had from expert witnesses about what goes on elsewhere, we have now had experience of 2 referenda in a short period of time. And I just think, because of the significance of the decisions, to set a minimum period at 10 weeks is perhaps just slightly too short. I would rather err on the side of caution, give the maximum time possible for such a debate, as well as allowing for the normal functioning of local government and the Scottish Government. So I think I've struck the right balance between having sufficient time as a minimum. I'm just about to finish, but indeed, of course, Mr. Mason.
Well, I'm still not clear why 12. I mean, rather than say 14 or 16 or 20, why 12?
I think 12 is better than 10. I mean, you could arrive in. Well, I have actually said, based on the experience we've had of 2 referenda, and I think you need to allow a minimum period where there is sufficient time for the democratic process to be thorough. I think 10 is just a bit too short based on the experience we've just recently had.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 75 and other amendments in the group, please.
I simply want to confirm that I believe that 10 is correct. The committee welcomed Scottish Government's openness to considering a minimum regulated period when it reported. The 10-week period was the view of stakeholders. It seemed to be an appropriate period, and therefore I think 10 is right. I think 12, there's no great harm in 12, but Jackie Bailey, I think, has an amendment later on for 14 in other circumstances, so this number just keeps growing. I think the stakeholder opinion in 10 was unanimous, as far as I recall. It would be up to Parliament to decide on a different referendum period, longer or shorter, for a particular referendum, if you're doing referendums by primary legislation, and that exists. But what would be the framework position? And I go back to that, because this is a framework bill. What would be the framework position? And the framework position appears to be what is supported. As for the the elegance or otherwise of the solutions. I can simply argue that the Amendment 75 has the same practical effect, but it fits within the nature of the other amendments, including the removal of powers in Section 1 and 2, which we have already considered. So it does fit in with the way in which the bill is drafted and cross-refers. In those circumstances, I would ask for Adam Tompkins not to press 4. That has an unfortunate but necessary effect on 4A, and 75 produces a result.
Thank you. Any member want to contribute at this stage? Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I'm pleased that there's agreement on putting the figure onto the bill, and I agree that Amendment 75 is the neater way of doing it. I think in deciding what that figure should be, there is an important balance to strike. It should be a minimum to ensure the referendum is held in a fair and legitimate and trustworthy way. But there's a danger of extending that minimum too much. In the case, for example, of amendments which are of referendums which are time sensitive, we haven't in this country so far, I'm pleased to say, gone down the route that some jurisdictions have of holding amendments on budgetary matters, for example, tax rates. But some countries have done that. I hope that we don't. But if a government was elected that considered it legitimate to hold a referendum on, for example, a national tax rate before a budget came into effect, there would be a clear time limit that would have to be achieved. So extending the time limit is a risk in relation to some referendums that we might want to hold. I recognise the point that Jackie Bailey makes about the comparison of the two big, controversial, highly contentious referendums that have happened in recent years. But I think that the contrast between them is not about that short regulated period. In relation to 2014, we effectively had 3 years of deep political debate because everybody knew that that referendum was coming. The shallowness of the 2016 referendum was not about the short number of weeks running up to the referendum date, but it was about the political conduct of the campaigns, in my view, and the absence, for example, of any consequences similar to the consequences for those who are dishonest in election campaigns, and we'll come to that question in a future group. So I don't see a case for 12, but I am happy that agreement has been reached to put the figure of 10, which we've heard clear evidence for, onto the face of the bill.
Okay, any other contributions? There being no other contributions, Adam Tompkins to wind up on Amendment 4, please.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I don't think there's anything further to say other than on this point of 10 or 12. The Electoral Commission is not pushing for 12. The Electoral Commission is pushing for 10. And indeed, the Electoral Commission has welcomed Amendment 75 in the Cabinet Secretary's name, specifying a minimum 10-week referendum period. I think Amendment 4 has already been moved, so I can't... I don't quite know the procedure is.
I will come and ask you at a later juncture whether you want to press or withdraw.
But I'm happy for the record to support Amendment 75 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, because I think it is, he's used the word inelegant twice now with regard to my impeccable drafting, which hurts, but nonetheless he can apologise later. But I do think that Amendment 75 is an elegant solution to the issue, and I'd be happy to support it.
Okay, Jackie Bailey to wind up on Amendment 4A and to press or withdraw.
I'm happy, given the debate that's happened, not to press Amendment 4A, although I note that it was elegantly written.
Does any member object to the amendment being withdrawn? No member objects. Therefore, Adam Tompkins to press or withdraw Amendment 4.
Withdraw.
Does any member wish to object to Amendment 4 being withdrawn? Okay, thank you. I now call Amendment 93 in the name of James Kelly and a group on its own. James Kelly to move and to speak to Amendment 93, please.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm pleased to return to the committee that I recently served on to move and speak in support of Amendment 93. Amendment 93 seeks to ensure that for a result to be valid in a referendum, there must be a 50% turnout. I think it's important to examine the context of the Referendums Scotland Bill in examining this amendment. as a government, we're very enthusiastic on the bill's publication to point out that the purpose of the bill wasn't just for an independence referendum, but was for referenda in general. In that regard, then, this amendment shouldn't be seen, as some have tried to misrepresent it, as something to try and meddle in a future independence referendum. Clearly, any future independence referendum, a turnout would exceed 50%, and it's disingenuous to suggest otherwise. In terms of other referendums, earlier in the session, moral referendums were referred to, and Patrick Harvey has just discussed the possibility of a referendum ahead of a budget on financial tax rates. In any of those cases, it's important that the referendum result isn't contested. If it were to be, the turnout were to be less than 50%, half the people in Scotland turning out, then the result would lack credibility and would be contested. So this amendment seeks to avoid that by ensuring that for any result to be valid, the turnout must be 50%. It should be seen in tow with other amendments, which I'll move later, to increase the length of polling time available, looking at the possibility of Saturday voting, increasing the information available to voters. All these amendments seek to increase information available to voters, to push up voter turnout, and therefore to lend democratic credibility to the result. And summing up, Convener, I believe that any referendum outcome must be seen as a settled will of the Scottish people. That comes into question if less than half the population vote in the referendum. Therefore, I would urge members to support this amendment, as it adds credibility and validity to the outcome of any future referendum.
Patrick Harvey.
Thanks very much. And can I, like I'm sure others, welcome James Kelly back to the committee. I think and I hope that we all want turnout to be high, whether at referendums or at elections. I think we would all want to see a politically engaged population who see voting as something important to do. But at the same time, I fundamentally respect people's right to abstain, to say a plague on all of our houses, whether as political parties or as campaign groups in a referendum, and to abstain and not have their vote counted. The effect of this amendment would be that abstentions are effectively counted against change. This amendment, I think, is rather like the suggestions that have been made elsewhere for a two-thirds majority. This would effectively give an inbuilt advantage to anyone arguing against political or social change in a referendum campaign as against those in favour of change. And I think on that basis it would breach the principle that everybody's vote should count for the same. I do want to commend James Kelly on one point, though, just the courage that he's clearly showing in coming to the committee and moving this. As someone who believes that 50% turnout is the gold standard of legitimacy, and as someone who was first elected to the Scottish Parliament on a 48.5% turnout, this would pose me no problems, but I'm sure it's slightly embarrassing for James Kelly. So I'm grateful for his efforts in overcoming that.
Thank you. Angela Constance.
Convener, in bringing this amendment forward today, I think Mr Kelly has succeeded in triggering an entire nation back to 1979. It is like the ghost of Christmas past, I'm afraid. And perhaps if I could point to the evidence that committee received from Dr Alan Rennick, who stated that turnout thresholds are clearly undesirable and a bad idea because they encourage people who are in danger of losing to suppress turnout in order to invalidate the vote. He also went on to say that the use of an electorate threshold was discredited by the 1979 experience, so you would be a brave politician to recommend introducing one in Scotland. So I think we can indeed agree that Mr Kelly is brave. Convener, I stick with my previous publicly made comments on this. In the context of a referendum on Scotland's constitutional future, I think this very much is a wrecking amendment. I think it is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I think it is anti-democratic for some of the reasons outlined by Patrick Harvey, because it assumes that not voting equates to a support for the status quo. And I have to say I'm vehemently opposed to this amendment.
Gordon MacDonald.
Just the fact, look, that we've discussed this morning that referendums are always about important issues that tend to engage voters. If you look at the history of referenda throughout the UK, Northern Ireland border poll 1973, EU membership 1975, right up to Scottish independence referendum 2014, EU membership referendum 2016, there has not been a minimum turnout requirement. I accept what Patrick and Angela have said about it discourages voter turnout. And we have to remember that in 1979 at the devolution referendum, the dead were recorded as voting no effectively. And we don't want to go back to that situation again.
No one want to take part. Tom, sorry.
I just want to put on record my opposition to this amendment for all of the reasons that have already been shared by colleagues, but principally because it incentivises a campaign to encourage people not to vote. And I think in an age when our democratic institutions and our democratic values are under attack, that is something we should not be seeking to encourage.
Okay, I don't see anybody else. Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, I think the last point is a very important point. It does incentivise people not to vote as a political action. It discourages participation. And I do find it inconsistent that there should be a proposal from Mr Kelly for this, and then later on to encourage participation by increasing the polling hours. I think if you look at the example of 1979, it wasn't exactly the same procedure that was followed, but it did create a whole series of anomalies, people who couldn't return to where they lived to vote. But if there were ferry difficulties, I know that because I lived in the Western Isles at the time, people who had more than one address, sometimes by mistake. There were a whole range of difficulties that were presented here. And the committee received no evidence at all to support the idea that thresholds should be followed other than a simple majority. So therefore, I do think this is, whilst a worthy attempt, a misguided one, and I would ask Mr Kelly not to press his amendment, but if he does press it, I would urge the committee to reject it.
Okay, therefore, James Kelly to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 93, please.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and indicate I will be pressing Amendment 93. I think ultimately the test on the amendment is, does it enhance the process of any future referendum? And I put it to you, again using Mr Patrick's example of financial powers or a vote ahead of a budget. If there was a less than 50% turnout, then that would be contested, and it would be difficult for the government or the... Yeah, I'll take an intervention.
I'm very grateful to Mr Kelly for taking an intervention. Given what he's just said, why does he think that all three independent reports into the use of referendums that we've looked at in this committee have unanimously concluded very strongly against threshold or turnout requirements? The House of Lords Constitution Committee, the Independent Commission on Referendums and the Venice Commission have all recommended against seeking to rig the rules of referendums by fiddling with either turnout or threshold requirements. Given that overwhelming evidence, why does Mr Kelly alone seem to think that doing so would enhance rather than inhibit democracy?
It's not a question of rigging the rules. It's a question of ensuring that any outcome has democratic credibility. And as I was going on to say, if you take a budgetary proposal to the country and less than half the people participate in that referendum, then when that result is returned, it will be contested and it won't be credible. I, along with other members, want to ensure that we see voter participation and that we see turnouts in excess of 50%, and that we therefore see credible outcomes to referendums. Moving on, Convener, I seem to have ruffled the feathers of some of the SNP members in terms of, you know, the 1979 amendment. I completely reject the notion from Angela Constance that this is some kind of Wrecking amendment. Nobody surely disputes the fact that if there was a future independence referendum, the turnout would be in excess of 50%. Let's face it, people would turn out in their droves to reject a notion that we enter into an arrangement where we've got a £12 billion deficit every year.
We can never give way.
And yeah, I'll give way, yeah.
But would you accept that in such a scenario, say the one side was winning 49-40, then the incentive is for the side that is potentially losing to not vote, and that would give them effectively 40 and 11-51, they would then win. So does he not accept that? Although, I mean, I accept his intention is good, that we should have more people voting. That's great. I mean, we all accept that. But in practice, does he not accept that we could end up with a very undemocratic result?
Look, that's just a nonsense that people would go around saying to people, let's not vote in this referendum. We're all politicians who care keenly about the democratic process, as do a lot of people in the country, and that is the spirit in which people would take part in any campaigns. I think ultimately what I'm seeking to do here is ensure that the outcome of referendums are credible, and I would ask members to support the amendment in my name with that in regard.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. The question therefore is Amendment 93 be agreed to or all agreed? There will be a division. All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. There were 2 votes for, 9 against. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call Amendment 94 in the name of Neil Finlay, group with Amendment 95. And I understand that Alec Rowley will be moving this particular amendment.
Yeah, in moving this amendment, Convener, can I give Neil
speak to both amendments in the group at the same time?
Finlay's apology that he's unable to attend. This proposal to create a category of referenda citizens' initiative which can be initiated from below is an attempt to help bridge that democratic gap. For much of its existence, the Scottish Parliament has seemed to many ordinary people to be cut off from the concerns of their daily lives. And it's important that we address that. By complementing the ongoing work of the petition system, we can help reverse trends which saw just over 45% of the population exercising their democratic right. The threshold to initiate such a process of 300,000 signatures is a substantial one, and about this we are unapologetic. Any issue which undergoes the time and expense of a referendum has to be one which is important to a very large number of Scottish people. However, even in cases where the 300,000 criteria is not met, we would expect to see increased democratic participation as citizens came together to campaign for the causes that matter to them. Something which the Scottish Government has consistently said it embraces. We appreciate the concerns that might surround such a novel proposal, but we want to revitalise our democracy, and bold steps are needed to do so.
Rowley, Jackie Bailey to speak to Amendment 95 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. This amendment builds on Amendment 94 in the name of Neil Finlay, setting out the citizen initiative referendum. I do think it's a novel approach which is designed to bridge the democratic deficit. Again, I've sought to provide what I regard as an appropriate timescale for such a referendum, and have suggested that the minimum period should indeed be 14 weeks. Now, on balance, I think more time is needed than would be the case in, for example, a government-initiated referendum, to ensure that there is sufficient time for the proposition to be well understood and sufficient time for proposals to be properly scrutinised and discussed. Hence my choice of 14 weeks, Convener.
Thank you. Any other? Patrick Harvey.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased that we have the opportunity to discuss this amendment, and I certainly wouldn't want to be thought as hostile to the idea of it. Greens have always argued that representative democracy should be part of our democratic process, but it should be augmented to and added to by participative and deliberative processes. And for that reason, we've championed issues like participatory budgeting, as well as petition systems when this Parliament was created, and indeed urging many councils around the country, which I think most, if not all of them, now have, to adopt public petition systems as well. And we're very pleased that there's now an approach to the use of citizens' assemblies, including at local level, but now at national level as well, currently in relation to broad constitutional questions, and then later on there'll be a citizens' assembly on climate as well. I think all of these things are new innovations which I welcome, but I suspect that we're not quite ready for this amendment in that context. I would very much welcome, for example, the view of the current Citizens' Assembly on the question, should a citizens' initiative be able to trigger a referendum? I think it would be more appropriate for us to hear from that viewpoint, from the viewpoint of the Citizens' Assembly participants, whether they regard this as a positive innovation in terms of participative and deliberative processes, rather than us deciding now, in the absence of very much in the way of clear evidence taken at stage one on the question. I think it would be premature for us to do that now in this bill, but I would very much welcome ongoing debate on the question, whether when the bill before us today it returns to stage 3 or through the Citizens' Assembly, if that body wished to consider a proposal along these lines. On 95, I'm again not convinced that there's a case for extending the periods in the way that Jackie Bailey suggests, but that would probably be not relevant if the committee chose not to support 94 anyway.
Thank you. Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with quite a lot of what Patrick Harvey just said. I think that one of the missed opportunities in this bill was, or at least so far has been, that we haven't really thought very carefully or deeply about the relationship between democracy by referendum, parliamentary democracy, and other citizen initiatives, including citizens' assemblies. And I think that it's unfortunate that this bill hasn't given us the opportunity to think through some of those issues a little bit more carefully and a little bit more deeply. But this amendment is bonkers. It's a really strange and extremely dangerous amendment that is fantastically ill-considered and ill-conceived. For example, it tells us that a referendum held under this section is advisory, as if other referendums might somehow be something different, without explaining what advisory means. And it also gets wholly wrong the role of the Electoral Commission. We've already debated this morning. This amendment says that it would be for the Electoral Commission to specify the wording of a referendum question. We've already seen that that is not what the Electoral Commission is for. The Electoral Commission is to give advice about the intelligibility of referendum questions. It is not the role of the Electoral Commission to specify or to bind. But the fundamental flaw in this amendment is that it will lock Scotland into an independence never-endum. Not a referendum, but a never-endum. There will always, unfortunately, I happily concede this point, Convener, unfortunately, there will always be 300,000 people in Scotland who think that Scotland should be an independent country. There will be many more, of course, who take the correct view. But this provision would enable 300,000. Excuse me, Convener, would enable 300,000 cybernats or 300,000 nationalist campaigners to petition the Electoral Commission for an independence referendum, and the provision says that once that number of signatures has been obtained, a referendum is to be held. We would have a permanent independence referendum under this provision, which just shows, this is an amendment moved today by Alec Rowley, but in the name of Jeremy Corbyn's left-hand man in Scotland, Neil Finney, just shows yet again how weak the Labour Party is on the question of protecting the Union. Well, this is a Labour amendment that would lock Scotland into a permanent independence never-endum. And for that reason, as well as its manifest inadequacies in terms of the detail of its very inelegant drafting, we will oppose it.
Nobody else has indicated. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do oppose this amendment, but not for the reason that Mr Tompkins has just entered into. I'm not an extremist in any sense. I don't veer between the extremes that Mr Tompkins is indicating, the extremes of either trying to have a perpetual referendum or the position that the acting leader of the Scottish Tories, Jackson Carlow, I'm not sure he's acting very well, but the acting leader of the Scottish Tories, things which apparently said this week there shouldn't be another referendum until 2054, when I will be 101. And there will have been 7 Scottish Parliament elections between now and then. That clearly is a ludicrous proposition. But amendment... Well, for the record, and I hope the record has it, that Mr Tompkins believes that it is too soon to have it at that time. I think that says something about democracy. Anyway, this, I don't use the word inelegant for this amendment. It is simply not thought through in any sense. It is threadbare. The amendment allows for any voter to initiate a referendum by starting a petition which goes on to collect 300,000 signatures. Why 300,000? The Scottish people are well known for their sense of humour, but I do note that the vote for Boaty McBoatface got 124,109 votes. So it is clearly possible for this to be used for a variety of purposes with that low threshold. The amendment lacks any detail who would be entitled to add their signature. Does it cover those of 16, 18 or any age? Do they have to be resident in Scotland? Can anyone in the world add their name to the petition? And then you go into the details of what the Electoral Commission is for and whether it would wish to take on the roles that are specified here. There's no consideration in this about the accuracy of the signatures, the eligibility of those signing, nothing at all. This is completely threadbare and absolutely out of place. It also fails to recognise that if an individual citizen wants to use a petition to initiate a referendum, then a route to do so already exists. It could be improved upon. I have some sympathy with Mr Harvey's position. I'm not absolutely in any sense against initiative referenda. But people can petition the Scottish Parliament. If they collect sufficient signatures, action can and is taken. The petition system does allow individuals to directly affect government policy. I state in evidence Gillian Martin's Seatbelts and School Transport Scotland Bill in February 2017. It received royal assent in December 2017 and it was directly related to the petitioning process. There is a way for the individual to try and change government policy through existing procedures. Can it be improved? Of course. Does this improve it? Absolutely not. I have to say that if this is a serious amendment, then it shouldn't have been brought in the terms that it is brought. But on top of the practical defects I've outlined, there's also the question of who would pay for it, how the Parliament would react to it, what the limits of the process are. I agree that there should be a debate on this. This is not the way to have the debate on this, and I urge the committee to reject it.
Thank you. I'd like Riley to wind up and press the withdrawal amendment 94, please.
Convener, I think Neil would be very disappointed that he wasn't able to get along today and engage in this discussion. And I would say that this was more of a probing amendment to start to widen the discussion around these issues, because there is in Scotland right now, if you said, and people know this referendum bill's going through Parliament just now, I'm sure many people would think, what on earth? We've had referendums, have caused utter chaos, they've divided our country. So there has got to be a wider discussion around how do you engage people. There are the politicians who believe that politics are, or is for politicians, except for when you want people's votes. So I think, whilst Neil Finlay's amendment has been criticised, he is trying to raise a wider issue about how you build on democracy and how you actually stop people from being turned off. The most common comment I get right now on the doors is we only see you when you want our votes. And so the way we do politics, in this country is changing. The Scottish Government's felt the need to bring forward a referendum framework bill. I don't intend to press this amendment, but I think Neil was quite right to flag up that we've got to look at how we actually engage people and make politics more relevant to people's lives.
Thank you. I still required, though, to ask any member of the object amendment being withdrawn. Okay, no member objects. I now call Amendment 95 in the name of Jackie Bailey. Already debated with Amendment 94. Jackie Bailey, to move or not move?
Well, given that I've lost Amendment 94, which was the hook, I will not move Amendment 95, Convener.
Thank you, Jackie Bailey. The question is that sections 4 and 6 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. 426, I should say, not 4 and 6. Thank you. We all agreed to 426. Yes. Thank you. Following the next grouping amendments, I intend to take a very short break, just to enable people to be comfortable. I now call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with other amendments as shown in the groupings. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 5 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. This is a group of 24 amendments. It covers technical amendments requested by the Electoral Commission and the wider electoral community. I don't believe there are controversial items in this, but of course they do need to be considered seriously. The first subgroup relates to the granting of emergency proxies and is covered by amendments 5 to 7. As introduced, this bill provides for voters to apply for emergency proxies when circumstances arising after the deadline for usual absent vote applications means the voter cannot attend the polling station on the day of poll. This is to ensure that voters are not disadvantaged due to medical, employment or situations beyond their control. Electoral registration officers have suggested that the current rules do not make adequate provision for some medical emergencies. A voter suffering a medical emergency near to the deadline for applying for absent votes may be undergoing treatment or otherwise incapacitated for a sufficient length of time that they cannot apply for an absent voter permission before that deadline. Whilst voting is important, applying for a proxy vote might not be the first thing sometimes what someone thinks of when coping with a serious medical event. On that basis, I brought forward amendments that would give electoral registration officers the power to grant an emergency proxy to voters in such circumstances. In applying for this proxy, voters will need to provide information about the medical event, why this meant they could not apply for a proxy before the usual deadline. This change will ensure voters are not unfairly prevented from voting because a serious medical event happens at a particular point in the electoral timetable. Amendments 8, 5, 19, 25, 26, 43, 50 and 64 all relate to the status of Easter Monday in the administrative timetable. Electoral administrators have asked that Easter Monday should be added to the list of days which do not count for the administrative timetable for the poll at a referendum. These days are normally referred to as dies non. The other dies non are Saturdays and Sundays, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, bank holidays in Scotland, and any day which is appointed for public thanksgiving or mourning. Electoral administrators are concerned that having a different set of dies non from those which applies at other devolved elections could possibly lead to confusion and suggest that a standardised approach would be appropriate. The government have accepted this argument, therefore we bring forward these amendments which will standardise the dies non across devolved elections and referendums. Amendment 9 was requested by electoral registration officers, removes a power for the chief counting officer to prescribe the form of the application to register to vote. The power to prescribe a bespoke registration form for the 2014 independence referendum was needed because it was open to 16 and 70-year-olds to register for a vote. Normally, when someone completes an application to register form, they are automatically registered for all elections in which they're eligible to vote. But in 2014, 16 and 17-year-olds did not have the vote at other elections, and therefore an application form was required which specifically referred to them being allowed to register only for the independence referendum. This power allowed the chief counting officer to prescribe that form and to require electoral registration officers to use it. Because the government has now extended voting to 16 and 17-year-olds at all devolved elections, something I would like to see for all elections in the UK, there is no need for a separate bespoke form. The normal registration forms, both online and in paper, make appropriate references to the 16 and 17-year-olds being able to vote at Scottish Parliament and local government elections, and therefore at any referendum. There is no need for the Chief Counting Officer to prescribe the registration form for future referendums. This amendment removes an unnecessary and sometimes confusing provision. Amendments 11 and 14 were requested by the Electoral Commission, require the Chief Counting Officer to consult with the Electoral Commission before issuing directions to counting officers or electoral registration officers. As it stands, the bill does not require consultation with the Electoral Commission. However, consulting with the Electoral Commission before issuing directions is already current practice at local government elections and is a proposed procedure for Scottish Parliament elections set out in the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. Even without this amendment, it is very likely that the Chief Counting Officer would informally consult with the Electoral Commission, as happened at the 2014 referendum. However, these amendments formalise the practice used in 2014 and ensure consultation with the Commission is always conducted in future polls in the same manner, therefore creating a high standard of administration and consistency. The consulting with the Electoral Commission ensures that directions have been externally reviewed, and the amendment will increase trust in the way the referendum is run. Amendments 10, 16, 17, 20, 21 and 22 allow for electoral registration officers to provide counting officers with 2 interim updates of the electoral register in the run-up to the close of registration, which is 12 days before the date of the referendum. These changes will bring referendums into line with devolved elections, where the provision of interim updates is normal practice. These amendments have the support of electoral registration officers. Interim updates assist counting officers to issue poll cards and postal ballot packs to newly registered voters or those who have changed their method of voting as early as practicable. Amendments 12, 13 and 14 are being brought forward at the request of electoral registration officers. Currently, paragraph 16.4 of Schedule 1 to the bill allows for electoral registration officers to appoint deputies for the purposes of the bill. However, we've received representations from registration officers that this differs from normal practice at elections, where local authorities approve deputy electoral registration officers. They are concerned that there might be a difference in what deputies are approved to do, which may cause difficulties. In line with these representations, we're now proposing that the bill be amended so that local authorities will be responsible for approving deputies rather than the EROs. This will mirror the equivalent provision for deputies at other devolved elections. Amendment 65, and I'm coming to the conclusion of this, fortunately, Convener, will allow the Code of Practice for electoral observers at local government elections to apply at referendums held in Scotland. This change has also been requested by the Electoral Commission. The Scottish Government are also seeking to extend the same code to Scottish Parliament elections through another bill currently before the Parliament. The Code of Practice for observers at Scottish local government elections is already in place and was laid before this Parliament by the Electoral Commission in December 2018. The Code of Practice explains how to become an observer, what is expected of an observer, and provides guidance for electoral officials on working with observers. It is written generally in a way which applies to observation at any electoral event and is not specific to a particular election. The Code functions well for other elections and referendums. Applying the existing Code of Practice to referendums under this Act will avoid the Electoral Commission having to prepare a separate code. I hope that those explanations are helpful.
Can the Secretary and the member wish to contribute?
I've got a question. Sorry, Convener.
No, on you go.
I've got a question, Convener, about Amendment 24, just to make sure I've understood it properly. Amendment 24 provides that before giving a direction to a counting officer, the Chief Counting Officer must consult the Electoral Commission. I think I don't really understand what these directions are. Am I correct, Cabinet Secretary, in understanding that these directions are not given to counting officers at the count? So there's no sense here that anything will be slowed down in terms of the process of counting votes. These are directions that are given by the Chief Counting Officer to counting officers well in advance of the count. I mean, I just wanted to understand that amendment isn't inadvertently going to slow down the process of counting votes.
No, there's a power of direction for the Chief Counting Officer, and it exists in, for example, local government elections, but it's a power of direction in terms of the conduct of the election. It's not a specific power of direction at a polling place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The amendments in this group are, for the most part, I hope, uncontroversial improvements. I am still a little unclear about the rationale for adding Easter Monday in Amendment 8 and those that follow it. It seems to me that it would be consistent to have, for the Minister to bring an amendment with a very long list of lots of different religious festivals, or not to include religious festivals. Christmas is clearly more than just a religious festival. It's something that's celebrated by secular society at large, not only by people who are religious. It seems to me that we would be consistent either including religious festivals of all kinds, as well as public holidays and secular events, or a much more limited list. So it's unclear to me why the achievement of regularity is best achieved by adding Easter Monday to everything rather than removing it from everything. Unless there's a slightly clearer rationale for that, I'll record an abstention on Amendment 8 when the time comes, and allow the others to go through if that passes.
The position that the member has...
Sorry, I better check there's nobody else wanting to contribute at this stage, so we can wind up properly and let's get this moving on. But right, there's nobody else. Okay, Cabinet
I'm
Secretary.
seeking consistency with the established list. You would be perfectly open to a member to seek to amend the established list in other legislation. I'm simply, at the request of the registration officers, seeking consistency with the established list. And Easter Monday is on that list because it remains a holiday. But I doubt whether I've convinced a member of this matter, and therefore note his position.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to or well agreed. We are agreed. I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 6.
Move.
The question is that Amendment 6 is agreed. Well agreed. Yes. I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move.
Move.
The question is that Amendment 7 is agreed to or well agreed. Yes. I now call Amendment 8 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
The question is, are we all agreed? No. Okay, there shall be a division. In which case, all those in favour, please show.
Of Amendment 8.
Yes, Amendment 8, correct. All those against. And all those abstaining. There were 10 votes for and 1 abstention. The amendment is therefore agreed to. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 9 to 22 en bloc.
Moved.
Does any member object to a single question being put in Amendments 9 to 22? No. Okay, the amendments 9 to... The question is, therefore, that Amendments 9 to 22 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Schedule 1 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you. As I indicated earlier, we'll now have a short break and therefore suspend for 5 minutes. Oh, sorry. Okay, colleagues, I now call Amendment 23 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 76, and I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Move formally.
The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 8 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 24 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 5. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 9 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Sections 10 and 12 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Sorry, 10 to 12 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Now call Amendment 25 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 5. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. So I now call Amendment 80 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with Amendments 96, 97 and 98. Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 80 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 80 in my name would ensure that the date of any referendum held under this bill would not be the same day as any other election or poll scheduled to be held throughout Scotland. And this amendment would give effect to a recommendation of the Electoral Commission and would give effect to the force of evidence that the committee heard at stage 1. Our advisor told us in our stage 1 inquiry that research shows that holding electoral events simultaneously can lead to lower quality electoral processes. The Association of Electoral Administrators endorsed that view, I think, and said that having more than one type of event on the same day adds to the pressures and difficulties in relation to resources. And on the basis of this and other like evidence, the committee concluded that given that referendums are most likely to be called solely on significant issues of major public interest, these should be standalone events. I think that referendums should be standalone events. I think that's in the interests of those who run electoral events, such as electoral administrators, and I think that's in the interests of voters. And the Electoral Commission is quite clear about this too. In its report into the 2016 EU referendum published in September 2016, the Electoral Commission said this, that the starting assumption for governments and legislatures should be that referendums are not normally held on the same day as other significant or scheduled polls. And in particular, referendums on significant constitutional questions, where political parties and other campaigners are likely to be working more closely together, should never be held on the same day as other scheduled polls. My amendment seeks to give force to that principle, that referendums, which are likely under this bill, let's face it, to be held, if at all, on significant constitutional events, on significant constitutional issues, should not be held on the same day as other polls. It may be that the Cabinet Secretary will argue that the word normally should appear in there and the word normally does not appear in there, but the word normally does not appear in there for the obvious reason that in all of our interaction on this bill, I have been consistent in asking the Cabinet Secretary to give me examples of issues other than Scottish independence, which he imagines this bill will be used for, and he's not given me an example. I don't think this bill is going to, I will in a second, Tom, yeah. I don't think that it's realistic to expect that we're going to have referendums on budgets or reproductive rights or anything else under this bill. I think that we are talking here about a bill that is designed to pave the way for an independence referendum, and an independence referendum should not be held. Well, full stop. But an independence referendum should not be held on the same day as any other poll, whether a referendum or election in Scotland. Happy to give way to Mr. Arthur.
I'm grateful to Mr. Tompkins for giving way. I just want to understand the implications for his proposed amendment. Were a referendum to be legislated for in this Parliament, and subsequent to that an electoral event was to take place simultaneously as a consequence of a UK government action such as a general election or UK-wide referendum, what would happen in that case? And I would use the example of 2011, where the AV referendum took place on the same day as the Scottish parliamentary election.
And that was an unhappy experience, and it should not be repeated. And I think that if this Parliament were to legislate to the effect that no referendum under this Act should be held on the same day as another significant electoral event, then that would be something that the UK government would want to take very seriously. Absent that, I mean, there's nothing at all to stop the UK government from holding a general election on the same day as a referendum. So this doesn't guarantee that we couldn't have a repeat of 2011, but it points in that direction, and should therefore, I think, be adopted. On the amendments in the other amendments in the group convener, in the name of James Kelly, I am agnostic about changing 7 a.m. to 6 a.m. and changing 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. But I am certainly not agnostic about changing polling day to a Saturday in the light of the extraordinary intervention yesterday in the general election campaign by the chief rabbi. What consultation has Mr. Kelly undertaken with the Jewish community in Scotland that holding a referendum on Shabbat is something that the Jewish community would want to feel relaxed about? It just seems to me to be, yet another very unfortunate sign that the rights of this community are being willfully overlooked by one of what used to be one of the major parties of the United Kingdom. Polling is held on Thursday in this country for good reason. It's not a religious day in any of the major religions in the United Kingdom. Friday voting would cause very significant complications for the Muslim community. Saturday voting would cause very significant complications for the Jewish community. It is Shabbat. And Sunday would cause significant complications for practicing Christians. And I'm not opposed to having an open mind about changing the date of polling, but I would want to see that there has been very substantial consultation with religious minorities, particularly in the current context of the extraordinary intervention that we saw yesterday of the chief rabbi. So I would urge, convener, that in conclusion the committee to reject Amendment 96 in James Kelly's name and to support Amendment 80 in mine.
James Kelly to speak to Amendment 96 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, convener. Pleased to speak to amendments 96, 97 and 98. I'd split the amendments accordingly. I would say that 96 is a probing amendment, and I'll explain why shortly. 97 and 98 are amendments I certainly want to press. I think there's a duty on all of us to seek to increase voter turnout. Thursday is always seen as a traditional polling day. I think it is worth examining the possibility of weekend polling. The amendment prescribes a Saturday, a Sunday could also be looked at. I think moving to a day where people aren't, not as many people are at work, gives a greater opportunity for people to participate. A Thursday also, if people are working, they can have caring or childcare responsibilities, which potentially restricts them getting to the poll. So I'm interested in probing if there are alternative days that may increase voter turnout. I think in terms of the hours, I think it should be moved from a 15-hour voting day to a 17-hour. People increasingly are leading, more flexible lives with more demands on their time, and I think therefore it makes greater sense for the polls to open at 6 and close at 11. It doesn't seem that long ago when council elections were constrained to an 8 o'clock start and an 8 o'clock finish, and that moved to a 7 start and a 10 o'clock finish, and that has increased voter turnout in those in the hours of those elections. I would ask members to take these points on board in terms of considering the amendments.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think my main argument, especially against Mr Kelly's amendments, is just the fact that we as a committee have not taken evidence on these things. Some of them, as Adam Tompkins has indicated, could be quite controversial, could impact sections of the community, and we just frankly have not looked at these in any detail whatsoever. And I think it would be very unfortunate to take amendments at stage 2 when effectively we haven't looked at it at stage 1. This is something I feel quite strongly about in the parliamentary process. It's even worse if they appear at stage 3 with no evidence. But to have amendments appear at stage 2 when we haven't looked at them at stage 1, I think does undermine the whole bill process, in my opinion. I mean, specifically, I do have some sympathy with the idea of it shouldn't be fixed to Thursdays. What's so magical about Thursdays? The fact that, especially in Glasgow, so many schools are closed is hugely disruptive to parents and teachers and children. So there is a lot to be said for Thursday being a bad day. However, there are problems with other days as well, and some countries have voting over several days. So you might have 3 days or a week or whatever, and you could all vote, which would be another way of doing it. But again, we haven't taken evidence on that. As far as the actual hours are concerned, I mean, I have polling places where I think less than 100 people turn up in the course of a day over 15 hours. It's going to be even quieter if it's over 17 hours. And one of the answers for people who can't vote, including the staff who staff the polling places, is that they get a postal vote. So I think we'd have to look at this in conjunction with can we have postal votes, can we have other forms of voting, rather than just extending the hours. Can the staff actually get there if there's a 17-hour polling day? We don't know that. So for all of these reasons, but particularly the fact we haven't taken evidence, I would suggest we reject these amendments.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. To take James Kelly's amendments, first of all, I do think it would have been maybe sensible to consult properly before lodging Amendment 96. I'm personally quite open to the idea in principle of multi-day voting, as Mr Mason just mentioned, although while perhaps an interesting principle, it would also have significant practical implications for the cost of running a poll, as well as for the volunteer time that we all know as political parties. You know, a vibrant election relies on a lot of volunteer effort from political parties and campaigners, and we shouldn't take that for granted either. So I'm not convinced that we should change the bill at this point to go either for a different day or for multi-day polling. And I'm not hugely aware of a desperate demand for a 6 a.m. rush at the polling stations, or indeed an 11 p.m. rush either. So I'm not totally convinced that the need to extend the time is there. In relation to Amendment 80 from Adam Tompkins, we do all agree, I think, that referendums should be standalone events. I would say the same about elections, and in particular, not just that a referendum shouldn't happen, or an electoral event shouldn't happen on the same day as another, but they should probably be separated out by some reasonable period. I don't share Adam Tompkins' confidence, though, that we can simply rely on the goodwill of the UK government to respect a date of poll that has been set for a referendum and not call an election in the same period. We've seen just recently with the 2017 snap election, that was called right in the middle of the Scottish local election campaign. So the level of respect for the need to separate out electoral events simply isn't there at the moment. It hasn't been shown to be there. So I don't think we can rely on it. And I would worry that if we passed Amendment 80 and subsequently passed legislation setting the date of a referendum and a UK snap election was called in the middle of it, I would worry that we would end up with our referendum process being the one subject to court action. I would worry that there would be a challenge against the legitimacy of holding that referendum at a time when a UK election had subsequently been scheduled. And I would very much worry that we're asking to bind ourselves to something that we are not in control of. And so I'm not convinced that even though electoral events should be standalone, I'm not convinced that Amendment 80 is a reasonable way of achieving that.
Tom Arthur.
Thank you. With regards to Amendment 96 concerning a polling day on a Saturday, I share similar concerns to Adam Tompkins about the apparent lack of consultation, and as someone who grew up in East Renfrewshire and represents part of East Renfrewshire, I'm particularly conscious of it, both as it's a potential barrier to participation for certain communities, particularly the Jewish community, in voting, but also for those who are politically engaged and politically involved across all parties to participate in election day activities. Again, that creates a potential barrier. So I think there would have to be detailed consideration, engagement and consultation before looking to take that measure any further. With regards to Amendments 97 and 90, in my experience, I don't sense any particular demand that people want to be able to come to polling station before 7 o'clock or indeed generally after 10 p.m. I'd also note that there's no reference to when a count should take place. So presuming that a count were to take place on a Sunday following a Saturday referendum, that would have implications particularly for the Western Isles as well. Again, it's sense that this amendment's been drafted without full consideration of other communities across Scotland, and there's also the matter of a count being delayed by a further hour if polling is till 11 p.m, meaning that staff, particularly at the count, and all in Police Scotland, etc., will face delays in concluding their day's work. So for these reasons, I don't think I'm able to support the amendments in the name of James Kelly.
Alec Rowley.
I take on board the point that Patrick made about Amendment 80, but I think the principle is absolutely right, and I'm happy to support it. James Kelly has said that 96 is a probing motion, and I think that's right. I mean, I go to Mass on a Sunday morning, but if voting was a Sunday, that's not going to stop me from going to Mass or voting. But the principle of this bill in effect, the irony of this bill is really about a referendum, a Scottish independence referendum, and as we know, that I think was one of the highest turnouts in my lifetime. But the fact is that when we are talking about referendums or we're talking about elections, we do, I think, and that's the point with James probing with these motions, we do need to start looking at why, in general, across Scotland, turnout is pretty poor. And elections and by-elections and council elections. We saw in Hong Kong last week in local authority elections a 70-odd% turnout, but that's because of the difficulties that are there. So there are genuine issues, but happy to support Adam Tompkins in terms of 80, and given that James is probing with these, hopefully he won't push them at this time.
Alec Burnett.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I think Adam Tompkins' objections to 96 on religious grounds are sufficient enough, but I'd just like to speak in support of John Mason's criticism of it not being enough consultation, and maybe slightly repeat some of the comments of Tom Arthur made in respect of James Kelly's amendments on 2 points. One of the staffing of polling stations and problems in doing that if hours are extended, particularly for small rural polling stations, which I know have struggled already to get them staffed. And again, as Tom Arthur raised, the point of the impact of changing the date and the impact of that on the timing of a count, particularly where the staff are predominantly council employees, could end up working Saturday night and Sundays.
Okay, no other members indicated they want to speak. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Can I split these into two sets of amendments? In terms of Amendment 80, I do agree that there should not be a conflict of dates. I am happy to look at a solution to that issue, but Mr Tompkins' Amendment 80 doesn't provide it. It provides, in his words, the force, but it does not provide the answer to it. What would happen if, after a referendum date was chosen, an unscheduled election is set for the same date, and the UK Tory government presently sort of specialises in unscheduled elections? The amendment doesn't answer the question about how you would resolve that issue. So if Mr Tompkins were not to move this, then I'd be happy to look at discussing with him about how you could provide a solution to the problem within the bill, as opposed to simply postulating what the problem is and saying there should be an outcome, but without having the proper outcome. So I take it seriously. I want to achieve a result, but this is not the result I think that will produce what we need, but we still have time to do that at stage 3. Mr. Kelly's amendments are of a different quality, I have to say. Let me just address, first of all, Alec Rowley's point about turnout. Turnout is a product of engagement. No doubt about that, that is what actually takes place. So it is engagement with politics that produces turnout rather than necessarily changing the arrangements that exist, although clearly if the arrangements are barriers, they should be. But, there's no evidence that Thursday is a barrier. Indeed, people have been going to the polls on a Thursday for over 80 years. And there's no indication that there's something about a Thursday that stops people turning out, whereas a Saturday would help people to turn out. And this isn't a probing amendment. This is actually a restricting amendment. Because, in fact, there is no requirement for the polling day to be a Thursday in this bill or in any other Scottish electoral legislation. It can be varied. And particularly if you're going to bring another bill, this is the framework. So don't tie the framework down to something for which there's no evidence. You can bring in a bill a specification for a specific day. And that is perfectly possible to do. So this amendment is not necessary. And I do share the concern that an amendment should come which has considerable implications in terms of one community, just as Friday would have implications for another community, and Sunday would have implications for at least part of another community. There should have been some thought about this. This is the wrong amendment. It's done in the wrong way. It shouldn't be proceeded with. Then we should look at polling hours and see what effect that they have. I think all of us who are working politicians, if there are two words that can go together, actually know that the pressure lies in different times of the day, not at the opening of the poll or the very closing of the poll. The time between, certainly in my experience, the time between 7 and 8 a.m. is the quietest time. But certainly by 9:30, things have significantly quietened down. If you could add an extra hour in the middle of the day, not the concept I think you could probably work with, you would be able to do something. But you can't, it doesn't have this effect by extending the hours in this way. It would increase the cost, but for very, very minor arrangement. There are arguments to say we should have multiple day polling. Of course, at one stage in these islands, we did have multiple day polling. It would be possible to look at that. But the solution is not to extend in this way. And indeed, the bill includes provision to cover those who are in a queue at the polling station at 10 p.m. So if there is any difficulty at the end of the day, that is already taken care of. If you are at the polling station before 10 p.m. and you still wish to cast your vote, you can do so. So there's no cut-off moment here. So in my own view, I'm happy for this government to consider with Mr Tompkins the issue which he has raised in Amendment 80. The Amendment 80 does not provide what we need, but we might be able to do so. As for the other ones, one of them is, I think, thoughtless and wrong, and the other one does not produce the effect that apparently it's meant to produce, and I would not support it.
Thank you. Adam Tompkins to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 80, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'm trying to think of how one might elegantly draft a provision that could provide for an additional hour in the middle of a polling day, and that's something of a challenge between now and stage 3. I hear with the force of the criticisms that have been levelled at the effect, but I think not the intention of Amendment 80. Amendment 80 was lodged in good faith to try to seek to give effect to an important recommendation of the Electoral Commission, which was endorsed by this committee in its Stage 1 report, that referendums should be standalone events and should not be confused with other electoral events. But I hear the force of the criticisms, and I would be very happy to work or to seek to work with the Cabinet Secretary and indeed with others between now and stage 3 to see if we could achieve that result through better means. So with permission, Convener, I will seek to withdraw Amendment 80 with the expectation that we will revisit the issue in one form or another at stage 3. And I have nothing further to say about the other amendments in this group.
Okay. Does any member object to Amendment 80 being withdrawn? Okay, no member objects. I now call Amendment 96. In the name of James Kelly, already debated with Amendment 80. James Kelly to move or not move?
Not moved.
The question is that Amendment... I'm sorry, I don't need to do that any longer. Call Amendment 97 in the name of James Kelly, already debated with Amendment 80. James Kelly to move or not move?
Not moved.
I now call Amendment 98 in of James Kelly. Already debated Amendment 80. James Kelly to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 26 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 5. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to or well agreed?
Yes.
We're agreed. The question is that Schedule 2 be agreed to or well agreed?
Yes.
We're all agreed. The question is that Section 13 be agreed or well agreed?
Yes.
We're all agreed. I now call Amendment 99 in the name of Alec Rowley, grouped with Amendments 100 to 103. Alec Rowley to move Amendment 99 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
My intention, Convener, is to withdraw Amendment 99, 101 and 105.
So you don't want to speak. You don't want to speak to us. You're not moving, is what you're saying.
No.
Okay, that takes me, I think, then to Jackie Bailey to speak to Amendment 101 and other amendments in the group.
I'm continuing my fixation with timing, Convener. The purpose of this amendment is very straightforward. Specifies that the application period for campaigners should be set at 8 weeks instead of the 4 weeks currently in the bill. And committee members, I hope, will have spotted a theme to my amendments. This is all about giving plenty of time for the process, because I don't believe democracy should be rushed, and this allows therefore more time for campaigners to register. Referendum will undoubtedly be about serious matters, and the process, in my view, shouldn't be rushed. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. James Kelly to speak to Amendment 102 and other amendments in the group.
Okay, Convener, 102 seeks to allow the granting of £100,000 to designated organisations, subject to any conditions set out by the Electoral Commission. What it seeks to do is ensure that any organisation that is designated as such has proper access to the campaigns. There are some campaign organisations who aren't as well funded and potentially wouldn't have a proper voice, a proper platform in the campaign without that funding. And what this amendment is seeking to do is to give voice to all views within any referendum campaign and make sure that the views are they're able to communicate the views to voters.
Any other member want to contribute? Gordon MacDonald, please.
Yeah, I'm just not convinced that this is required. I mean, the bill already allows for the normal level of support for participating organisations. They get campaign broadcasts, free use of rooms for public meetings and free mailings to every single voter. The cost of the free mailings alone the last time at the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Independence referendum was 1.6 million. And I think that's probably adequate support. I mean, we're talking about important issues that are going to engage voters, and I would imagine that both sides in any referendum that has engaged voters would have no issues in raising the necessary amount of funds for campaigning.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I think I'm not sure Jackie Bailey is going to convince me on any of the amendments that she's brought today. I'm sorry about that. The application period for a permitted participant to apply to become a designated body, this seems to be such a minor aspect of the process that I really don't see a great need to extend that. You know, having a month to allow those existing established organisations to go through the application process, it does seem to me entirely adequate, and I'm not aware of any problems that have been caused in the past by there not being sufficient time for that to happen. In relation to Amendment 102, my party does support the public funding of our democratic process, and we think that would be far better to have a modest and capped level of public funding of the democratic process rather than allowing the super rich in our society donate large amounts of money, either as individuals or as businesses, to political parties or to campaign bodies. People should have an equal vote and the countries, in my view, which are most successful, pluralistic, multi-party democracies do involve some degree of public funding, which is absent in Scotland and the UK. Having said that, I would ask James Kelly, if he has a chance to wind up, I don't know if he does or not, to explain what kind of discussions he's had with interested bodies to explore why this amendment should be brought in at this stage and at the level that he's proposed it, and whether he's in fact proposing that the same approach should be taken in relation to elections as to referendums. I don't know if he's able to intervene. It's a chance to wind up.
Fully entitled to intervene, but he's got no wind-up opportunity. So.
To help the discussion, can I intervene? So,
if you, I'd be grateful.
I mean, what I would say is that I'm aware from my experience as a campaigner that there are groups and there who are not able to. I mean, Patrick Harvey mentioned rich people and organisations funding campaigns. There are people who are disaffected who don't have that same facility. So it's my experience as a campaigner that leads me to believe that it's important that designated organisations in any referendum should receive an appropriate level of funding. I'm open to discussion as to what level of funding that should be, and also I'm open to consideration in terms of general funding around elections.
Well, I'm grateful to James Kelly for intervening. My instinct would be to be willing to discuss alternative approaches to this issue ahead of stage 3. I don't know whether there's any chance it would get a majority of support or not, but I think if we were to do something along these lines, it should involve permitted participants, not just designated organisations. You know, I think that's perhaps something that we could consider in future rather than bypassing Amendment 102.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 101 would double the period of time for organisations to apply for designation. The time limit set out in the bill, whatever your view of the referendum in 2014, it operated well. There was no evidence from stakeholders requesting this change. I don't think there is a case for this change. I'll ask committee to reject the amendment. At stage 1, the committee rejected the suggestion that the bill be amended to include a provision for public funding of campaign groups, as there was not enough evidence to support that change. I'm not inherently against that. I have Patrick Harvey's view that I think that supporting democracy is an important thing to do, and the more that money pours into democracy, and particularly dark money, the more we should be concerned about this. And of course, later on we'll have the opportunity to consider the maximum level of fines that the Electoral Commission can impose. But there's been no indication from James Kelly he's taken any evidence on this, what the level of funding should be, and in these circumstances I don't think it's thought out or thought through, and it goes against the committee report, so I think the balance is against supporting it at this stage.
Thank you. Just for clarity purposes at this stage, Amendment 99 was not moved by Alec Rowley, but to ensure proper process I still need to call Amendment 100 the name of Alec Rowley, already debated, or not in this circumstance, not moved. Thank you. I now call Amendment 101 the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated Amendment 99. Jackie Bailey, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Now call Amendment 102 in the name of James Kelly, already debated with Amendment 99. James Kelly, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Now I now call Amendment 27 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary group with Amendment 28. Cabinet Secretary, move Amendment 27 to speak to both amendments in the group.
Convener, in the Stage 1 report, the committee supported the recommendation of the Electoral Commission that the reasonable costs of producing campaign material in accessible formats for people with disabilities should not be included within spending limits. In line with this government's aim of encouraging those with disabilities to participate in elections and referendums, as well as other political activity, I am delighted to accept this recommendation. Amendment 27 exempts any costs that might arise from making reasonable adjustments so a disabled person is able to undertake their role either in a paid or voluntary capacity from counting towards a campaign organisation's expenditure limit. Similarly, exempts costs associated with providing campaign materials or supporting campaigning in ways which are more accessible to those with disabilities. An example might be providing a British Sign Language translator when talking to a group of voters, including those whose first or preferred language is BSL. The intention is to encourage campaign organisations to involve disabled people in their campaigning, to make that campaigning more accessible to those with disabilities without them having to be concerned about exceeding the campaign limit. Amendment 28 exempts reasonable costs associated with providing security for the protection of those attending rallies or other public events in connection with the referendum. This also flows from a recommendation of the Electoral Commission. While protection of the public is a police matter, the police cannot be everywhere at once. During a referendum campaign, there are multiple events taking place in a short timescale, and they can stretch resources available. The intention is not to allow campaigners to employ security staff to stifle legitimate opposition, but to ensure that opposition does not endanger the safety of those taking part. In line with this, where a campaign organisation wants to make use of this exemption, the expenditure will have to be reasonable, and the Electoral Commission has oversight of campaign expenditure. I hope the committee will agree this is a measured response to threats of violence at political events. They will agree that the safety of the public should not be affected by campaign expenditure limits. These are positive ways to ensure referendums held under this framework, and I stress it is a framework, are inclusive as well as safe, and therefore I commend the amendments to the committee and move Amendment 27.
Thank you. Anybody got any points I'd like to raise? John Mason.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Just a minor point. I mean, I very much welcome the theme of this and where we're trying to go with it. I just wonder if there is any opportunity for abuse. What I was particularly thinking was of producing material in a larger font, and that would be with the intention of making it available to people who are maybe partially sighted, but could be abused in that obviously everybody else could read it as well, and it could be a way of getting round the limits. So I would be interested if there will be a way of kind of controlling that, any potential abuse.
The Cabinet's going to do that when he's summing up. Ed Tompkins.
Thank you, Convener. I warmly welcome Amendment 27, and I have no questions or comments about that. Amendment 28 puzzles me a little bit. I just wanted to make sure I've fully understood it. And I've got a number of questions about it. Where is this? The first question is, where is this coming from? The first question is, where is this coming from? Is it something which the Electoral Commission has suggested? Is it something which Police Scotland have suggested? I don't recall. I may be wrong, but I don't recall that we've taken any evidence on it. And secondly, Cabinet Secretary, your purpose and effect notes, which you very kindly shared with the committee, for which thanks, say that the purpose and effect of Amendment 28 would mean that the cost of providing reasonable additional security costs over and above what is provided by the police will not count as referendum expenditure. And then it goes on to say that the organisers will still have to fund the cost of the security arrangements, but that cost will not count towards their expenditure limit. So what is the? How do we know that that would always be the case? What guarantees that additional security costs would be that the bill for additional security costs would be footed by campaigners or by organisations rather than by the taxpayer or the police? And if that's guaranteed somewhere in law, where is it? And how does Amendment 28 tie in with that? And I just want to make sure that the dots have been appropriately joined.
The answer to both those points, Convener, if I might, lies in the word reasonable, and it's in, of course, the text of both 27 and 28. Reasonable expenses in 27 are reasonably attributable to individuals' disability. There's a judgment to be had that this. I'm sure that in Mr. Mason's case, if there was an attempt to be unreasonable at this, this would be a matter for the Commission. And of course, 28 has reasonable expenses incurred providing for the protection of persons. Now, this arises, as I understand it, from the Electoral Commission's recommendation from the 2016 referendum, where there were, of course, issues of security and issues of violence. There is no intention that this will be met from public costs. This is about costs that a campaign meets and the costs that they then have to declare. And it is about the limits of those costs. And again, the word reasonable applies within them. So I hope that addresses both points.
Okay, that was just an opportunity for clarity rather than a winding up situation. So, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Happy to welcome both these amendments. In relation to 27 and the provision that costs in relation to providing material in Braille or providing sign language translators at campaign events is not going to be covered as part of the calculation of election expenses, of referendum expenses. I would just like to ask the Cabinet Secretary whether the same consideration was given to translation of material into minority languages that don't relate to disability, given that we're looking to extend the franchise, I hope, on the basis of residency rather than nationality. There will be particular parts of the country with large numbers of people who are entitled to vote whose first language is not English, and I would ask whether that is already covered somewhere else or whether the government considered including that in the same manner as translation for the purposes of disability.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't think it is covered elsewhere, and I think it is a good point. I can immediately think that there might be circumstances in which the bulk of the material in some constituencies might not be, and therefore there would be an offsetting cost about other material that's not produced. But I'd be happy to look at that as an issue, but it's not an issue that has been considered so far in this bill.
Nobody else is willing to contribute. Do you want to wind up, Cabinet Secretary? No, I don't think you would. Okay, the question is Amendment 27 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is Amendment 20... Sorry, apologies. I call Amendment 28 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. I already debated Amendment 27. Cabinet Secretary to move forward.
Moved.
The question is Amendment 28 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
No.
Okay, there will be division. All those in favour, show, please. Okay, all those against? Those who are abstaining. There were 8 votes for and 3 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. I now call Amendment 103 in the name of Alec Rowley. Already debated Amendment 99. Alec Rowley to move or not move?
Not move.
I now call Amendment 29 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 76. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 29 be agreed to, or we all agreed? We are agreed. Now call Amendment 104, name of Jackie Bailey, group with Amendment 105. Jackie Bailey to move Amendment 104 and speak to both amendments in the group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener. This time I want to shorten the timescales available, and I'm happy to move both these amendments in the group. Again, the purpose of the amendments is very straightforward. Amendment 104 specifies that returns which require an auditor's report must be submitted to the Commission within 3 months of the day that the referendum took place. The bill, of course, provides for 6 months. I believe that's too long. Amendment 105 specifies that returns which do not require an auditor's report should be submitted within 1 month and not 3 months contained within the bill. And the reason I've suggested this is I think financial probity in any election or indeed referenda is essential, and minds need to be focused on making financial returns as soon as possible. We have seen, unfortunately, various investigations into misconduct. I'm thinking of the Vote Leave campaign, and I think it's very important that there is a swift and stringent process to examine electoral spending, and I think it's equally important that we make sure that we retain trust in the referendum outcome, and financial probity is a key part of that process. So I move Amendments 104 and 105 in my name, Convener.
Anyone want to contribute? No. Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, as I explained to the committee in my response to the Stage 1 report, the Scottish Government shares the Electoral Commission's views and has discussed post-poll reporting arrangements with the Commission. There are a number of shared concerns, and Jackie Bailey is expressing them, and the matters to be considered in developing this proposal, but there is an issue about the practicality of shortening the timescale for audited accounts. The Scottish Government has agreed with the Commission that this issue should be continued further, including consulting with political parties who have experience of making these sorts of returns, with a view to developing the best measures to elicit the practicality of the Commission's proposals. I would expect that once those further considerations are complete, the Electoral Commission would recommend that this Act be amended to reflect what would be agreed proposals with the political parties. I would therefore ask Jackie Bailey not to press her amendments on the grounds that the Scottish Government and the Electoral Commission are already working on this issue, and it wouldn't be proper and sensible to preempt the outcome of these discussions with the parties who know how the audited accounts are presently prepared. Again, the intention is admirable. The Commission, the Scottish Government and Jackie Bailey is one on this, but there hasn't been enough agreement as yet with the political parties to allow it to be fully enacted.
Could Jackie Bailey to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 104, please?
I'm happy on the basis of the Cabinet Secretary's comments not to press both amendments, but I am assuming from his contribution that we will be in a position by stage 3 to have this completed. Oh, we're not. Okay. I wonder whether I could get the Cabinet Secretary to intervene on me to tell me what timescale it would be appropriate.
We have no indication yet that the political parties are in a position to agree this. There is a small matter of an election ongoing at the present moment. It is not at the top of political parties' minds on this, so there is it will not be amended as far as we can see at stage 3. It would be possible, I think, to bring this in another form, in another bill. We will try and do so, but it can't be done before stage 3.
Okay, I'm happy to withdraw now, but I think I probably want to engage in further discussion with the Cabinet Secretary about what assurances we are and what timescales will apply.
Okay, does any member object to Amendment 104 being withdrawn? Okay, thank you very much. I still need to call, though, Amendment 105 in the name of Jackie Bailey. I read debate with Amendment 104. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Withdraw.
Not moved. Now call Amendment 30 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with other amendments as shown in the groupings. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 30 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. These amendments make two main changes. They change the criminal procedure and accordingly the maximum penalties attached to certain campaign offences, so they are no longer restricted to being triable using summary procedure, but can also be prosecuted using solemn procedure. Second, they increase the maximum monetary penalty that the Electoral Commission can impose from £10,000 to £500,000. Let me start by explaining the rationale for the criminal procedure charges. The current changes. Currently, a number of campaign offences are triable only by summary procedure, subject to a low maximum penalty of a fine not exceeding level 5 on the standard scale. The Electoral Commission has requested that the criminal procedure attached to some of these campaign offences should be changed from summary only to either way to potentially allow a jury trial with a consequent increase in associated maximum penalties available. They are concerned about potential abuses from bodies but also individuals who have significant financial resources. This would apply to failure to deliver a spending return to the Commission, failure to comply with an investigation requirement, failure to supply information to a relevant person, printing or publishing referendum material without details of a printer or publisher, failure to deliver donation or regulated loan or related transaction reports to the Commission. Part of the concern is that committing an initial offence deliberately may avoid a more serious offence from being detected. For example, failure to make an expenditure return could mask that an organisation had overspent its expenditure limit. Currently, the initial offence has a smaller penalty, so it would be open to a campaigner to avoid the higher penalty by not making a return and risking a relatively small fine. I agree with the Electoral Commission. Campaigners should not be allowed to evade discovery of a more serious offence, and have therefore brought forward these amendments to make committing the evasion offences subject to the higher maximum penalties. This will remove the incentive to avoid making returns or providing information to avoid a higher penalty, and generally mean that campaigners take the regime more seriously. The second change around offences was requested by the Electoral Commission, and this was an increase in the maximum civil monetary penalty which they could impose from £10,000 to £500,000. When I gave evidence to this committee at stage 1, I indicated I was content to accept the Electoral Commission's recommendation, and subsequently in your report on stage 1, the committee invited us to respond to the evidence from the Commission. The current position is that the Electoral Commission has powers to impose monetary penalties in relation to campaign offences. The level of maximum penalty varies depending on the criminal procedure that also applies to the offence. The Commission expressed concerns that the current level of fines available to it are not a sufficient deterrent. They were concerned that a £10,000 penalty might be seen as the cost of doing business to gain an advantage at a referendum. The Commissioner suggested a maximum fine of £500,000 would deter breaches of the campaign rules and has recommended that this change be made. Amendment 60 would accordingly increase the maximum monetary penalty which the Electoral Commission can impose from £10,000 to £500,000 for campaign offences, which could be tried before a jury. This is a significant increase, but it is commensurate with the penalties available to comparable regulators, such as the UK Information Commissioner's Office. For avoidance of doubt, if agreed, this increase will apply to those offences which I am proposing will move from being tried only by summary procedure to being triable either way. I should make it clear, and this is very important, the Commission's enforcement policy means it will continue to take a proportionate approach to the increase, but it will provide a real deterrent to those campaigners who may consider overstepping the mark. We will never know, but if Vote Leave had been more careful in sticking to the rules during an EU referendum campaign, would a penalty of 1.5 million for the various breaches have been more effective than a penalty of 61,000? My aim is to ensure that campaigners stay within the rules, but if they overstep them, they must be punished accordingly. I think that this increase in the maximum penalty which the Commission can apply for campaign offences represents a step change in deterrence, and it will help to encourage fair campaigning.
Any other member wish to contribute? Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Just to put on record my support for the amendments in these groups. The current situation in relation to the level of consequences for those who break the rules is clearly deeply inadequate. You know, even if we don't see heavy penalties of this kind being applied, if they act as a deterrent, that would be extremely welcome. We've all seen the misbehaviour that took place during the 2016 EU referendum. We all know that if that had been an election, it would have been declared illegitimate. There are profound questions over the democratic legitimacy of that outcome, given the behaviour of the Leave campaigns, plural. And if there is any chance that a more substantial approach to consequences could prevent such corrupt practices from happening again, we should all welcome it.
Wonderful. Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I don't object to the amendments being put forward, and I appreciate they are following up on recommendations from the Electoral Commission. But I want to reiterate a point I made when we took evidence on this as a committee, which is that given these fines are often levied long after the event, and the campaign groups involved may well have spent all their money or indeed have been wound up entirely, I struggle to see how this presents a potential deterrent. You know, if in the example that the Cabinet Secretary has given, whether the Vote Leave campaign post the referendum date would have had any resources to pay a fine of £1.5 million is a moot point. And I'm just not entirely sure how fining people large sums that they can't pay long after the event has actually occurred does represent a deterrent. And I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary has any view on that, but I just, while I entirely sympathise with what he's trying to achieve and don't disagree with the intent of these amendments, I'm not sure how practical they will be in terms of implementation.
Does anybody else want to contribute? No, for Cabinet Secretary. Just wind up at the same time, please.
Yeah, I think it is a strange approach to the law to say that we shouldn't have penalties or question the penalties because we're doubtful if people can pay them. These are very serious offences. The penalty for those offences should reflect the seriousness of the offence. I think that's a principle that's worth supporting going forward. I have no more to add. I've made the points about it, and I think they should be, the committee should unanimously endorse this if it can.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 31 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. I already debated with Amendment 30. Cabinet Secretary move formally.
I moved.
The question is that Amendment 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're agreed. I now call Amendment 81 in the name of Adam Tompkins, group with Amendments 32, 33, 34 and 82. Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 81 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. My amendments in this group, Amendments 81 and 82, are concerned with what is informally known as the PERDA period for referendums. Amendment 81 effectively extends the period governed by PERDA rules, that's to say publications principally by government, to the whole of the referendum period, which I think we've already agreed will be 10 weeks. So it extends the PERDA period from, I think, 4 weeks to, or extends the PERDA period from 28 days to 10 weeks. That is an amendment which is supported by the Electoral Commission in their briefing for the Stage 2 proceedings, and is consistent with the evidence that we took at Stage 1. Our advisor advised us that the 28-day period was too short, or indeed that there was widespread concern that it was too short. Alan Rennick from the Constitution Unit at UCL said that given that campaigns begin well before the PERDA period, the rules do not prevent potentially influential government interventions in the campaign. And the Electoral Commission has long been of the view that PERDA should apply during the whole of any referendum period. And that is a view which has now been adopted by the cross-party Political and Constitutional Affairs Committee in the House of Commons, who have recommended, following the Electoral Commission, that PERDA be extended for the full referendum period. And this view was also supported by the Independent Commission on Referendums. So there's quite a lot of evidence from cross-party evidence and from independent sources, such as the Independent Commission on Referendums and the Constitution Unit, that this is an appropriate step to take. And for those reasons, I commend Amendments 81 and 82 to the committee, and I will also be supporting the 3 amendments in this group in the name of the Minister.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 32 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. Let me start by addressing Amendments 81 and 82 together. This was an issue that was looked at in some detail during the passage of the referendum on the EU, but in a different way, because then the UK Tory government tried to restrict even the 28-day period to allow it to undertake certain actions. I'm not proposing that. Now, the UK government was defeated on that matter, and it was defeated because the period of 28 days was seen as being the reasonable period in terms of an active government for the strict PERDA rules. And that's the position I take here, and that's why I will be asking people to reject Amendment 81 and 82. Ministers, civil servants and public bodies understand the 28-day period. Extending that to the full referendum period without at least narrowing the restrictions would significantly inhibit the government and others from conducting normal day-to-day business. An example would be scheduled statistic publications. As required by the UK Statistics Authority, these have to be published on certain dates without ministerial interference. The way this has been approached would actually restrict that. Now, the length of the pre-poll period was raised during the Stage 1 evidence sessions, and there were differing views. And the committee acknowledged that uncertainty by deciding not to recommend a period. But I think the 28-day period is an acceptable compromise, with one addition, and I'll come to that in a moment. Some referendums, such as the 2016 EU referendum and the 2014 independence referendum, have had very wide-ranging arguments, cutting across a vast number of policy areas. They would restrict all those areas for a 10-week period. For a 10-week period. That would cause significant issues for the normal work of ministers and public bodies. Now, there is a difficulty in finding the right balance, and there are administrative restrictions already in place for some actions. For example, members of the Scottish Parliament will know there is a longer period than the 4-week period in terms of issuing newsletters and information to constituents. And I expect that that would be, within the regulations of the Scottish Parliament, exactly what would happen in any referendum. But your report recommended that the 5th report of the Committee on Standards in Public Life acknowledged it was very difficult, if not impossible, for the government day to offer purely objective and factual information for that length of time. Now, certainly a government should remain neutral, but to set a 10-week regulated period does much more than that. It actually inhibits and stops government actions. Even those who've pressed for longer restrictions have argued those to apply to a narrower range of materials and to possibly exempt some public bodies from the restrictions. But Mr. Tompkins' amendment does not do that. And in all these circumstances, I think it is a very wide-ranging amendment that would damage the process of government business, and there are other ways in which voluntary restriction is already in place and working in these circumstances. However, of course, there is the possibility of further restriction and exemption. In its submission in response to this committee's call for evidence, the Scottish Parliament corporate body suggested an exemption for publications in the normal course for parliamentary business should be brought up to date and future-proofed. The corporate body's concern was the bill only referred at that stage to the Scottish Parliament's official website, didn't mention other parliamentary websites, so the Scottish Parliament TV or official Facebook and YouTube sites, nor did it mention social media use, such as the Parliament's Twitter account. The committee supported the Scottish Parliament corporate body proposed exemptions to bring this exemption up to date, and we brought forward Amendment 32 to allow that to happen. It will exempt all material published on all official Parliament websites and online platforms which are controlled by the Scottish Parliament corporate body from the pre-poll restrictions. And we've discussed the proposed amendment with the corporate body. I am content that this proposed amendment addresses their concerns. And Convener, in its report on stage 1, the committee recommended that electoral registration officers should also be exempt from restrictions on central and local government publishing promotional material. Given this committee's recommendation, I brought forward an amendment to exempt electoral registration officers from the pre-poll publication restrictions set out in Schedule 3. Paragraph 27 of Schedule 3 of the bill sets out the restrictions on the publication of promotional material by central and local government in the 28 days before the poll. It includes a list of bodies that are exempted from these restrictions: the designated campaign umbrella organisations, the Electoral Commission, the Chief Counting Officer or any other counting officer, but it doesn't include electoral registration officers. 28 days before the poll include a number of deadlines for important processes. Electoral registration officers should be able to publish appropriate information. That's in the interest of voters. So I ask the committee to accept Amendments 33 and 34, which will be complemented by Amendment 66, which we will discuss later, but I ask the committee to reject the other 81 and 82 as being impossible, essentially, in terms of normal public business.
Anyone want to contribute? Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I do think that Adam Tompkins' proposal, if it was agreed, would result in an unreasonably broad extended period. 27(1)(d), for example, on page 97, says that this restriction covers material which is designed to encourage voting in the referendum, and if 27(2)(c) includes public authorities who we expect to have a role in political education and encouraging voter turnout, particularly among young people, as we're debating elsewhere in the bill. That this potentially would lead to an extended period in which that voter education activity would itself be restricted, not just the business of government. So I do think that the amendments from Adam Tompkins go too far in this regard, and I won't be supporting them.
Nobody else wishes to contribute. Therefore, Adam Tompkins to wind up and press or withdraw amendment on 81, please.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I think we all accept that there should be a period of purdah, a period where government cannot use its ordinary resources, where what Mr. Russell referred to as the ordinary business of government is interfered with in the interests of voters. In the interests of voter confidence and the impartiality and accuracy of the process. So the argument is, how long should that period of interference last? Should it last only for the last 4 weeks of the campaign, or should it last only for the last 10 weeks of the campaign? That's the argument. And I think that when trying to reach a conclusion on an issue such as this, the right thing to do is actually not to put the interests of government first, which is the force of what Mr. Russell has said. The right thing to do is to put the interests of the voter first. And the organisation that we have in the United Kingdom that represents the interests of voters is the Electoral Commission. And the Electoral Commission say that there are significant issues of voter confidence, specifically in referendum campaigns, where referendum campaigners must work within statutory spending limits for the whole of the regulated period, but where government and public authorities may spend potentially very significant amounts of public money throughout that period, other than in the last 4 weeks. And it is for that reason of voter confidence, maintaining voter confidence, that the Electoral Commission have recommended that the purdah rules should apply during the whole of the referendum period and not only for the last 4 weeks. Now, I accept that that will be inconvenient for government ministers, but in the balance, when one weighs the inconvenience of government ministers against the interests of voter confidence in a referendum on what is likely to be a very important subject, otherwise why is it being put to a referendum, I think I know where I would prefer the balance to come down. And again, you know, this is giving effect simply and straightforwardly, without unnecessary complication, to a recommendation of the Electoral Commission, which has been endorsed nationally and internationally, both by parliamentary committees and by international commissions that have looked at best practice with regard to referendums. And for that reason, I will press Amendment 81.
Thank you. The question is therefore, is Amendment 81 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? Yes. In which case there will be division. All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. All those who wish to abstain. There were 5 votes for, 6 against, and therefore the amendment is not agreed to. I call Amendment 32, 33 and 34, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 32 to 34 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 32 to 34? No member objects, so the question is that Amendments 32 to 34 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 82 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated with Amendment 81. Adam Tompkins to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you, Mr Tompkins. I now call Amendment 83 in the name of Patrick Harvey, grouped with Amendments 35, 36, 84 and 38. Patrick Harvey to move Amendment 33 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
83.
That's what I said.
Thank you, Convener. This moves on to the section which is about publication not by public bodies or government, but publications by anybody. And it's one that we've discussed during the stage 1 inquiry, and I think we have probably a range of views that we've heard in evidence centred around the fact that our current arrangements are not adequate for the digital age that we live in. But a range of views which probably haven't alighted on an absolute solution. So I don't imagine, and I certainly don't hope that whatever happens with the amendments in front of us today, that this would be the last word on this issue. I think we're going to need to continue to revisit this subject of how we regulate campaigning in the online space in future, both in relation to electoral law and referendums. The fact that we discuss this subject sometimes with the kind of shorthand title of digital imprints, I think itself symbolises the fact that we're still thinking about this form of regulation in the way that we did when campaigning was done with physical leaflets. Physical leaflets still exist, and we all still expect them to have an imprint on them, and information that goes through people's letterboxes or handed to people in the streets is expected to have that information to achieve transparency about who is publishing campaign material. It's not there in relation to a great deal of online campaigning. Online campaigning blurs the distinction between what is coming from campaign bodies and what is merely public discussion and public debate. Public discussion on social media in particular is in that blurred space. It is publication. It is publication. It is not, equivalent to folk chatting to their mates around the water cooler or in the pub. It is publication, and it can reach significant numbers of people. Even publication on social media by an individual whose own follower base on that social media platform is not massive can itself be boosted by others and achieve a really, really substantial degree of reach. It can be as powerful a campaign tool as a funded, paid-for commercial publication by campaign bodies or others. And so I think the requirements for transparency do still exist. They need to be applied differently in relation to individuals using social media purely as individuals, but I think they do need to be applied in some way. So I've come forward with an amendment which is different from the Cabinet Secretary's proposal. I want to explain first of all why I don't support the proposal from the Cabinet Secretary, Amendment 35, which would simply exempt from the requirement to provide that transparency information material that expresses the individual's personal opinion and is published on the individual's own behalf on a non-commercial basis. I fear that this would exempt material which is campaigning material, is being used by organised, well-funded campaign materials. Even if it isn't published by them, it is being used by them in an organic sense. Even if it's published by the individual but being used by the organisation, it's in that grey area, and I fear that it would go too far in exempting too much. So what I've suggested is an additional category, which is online publication, including material that is communicated by social media accounts controlled by individuals who are themselves campaigners, either by being members or donors of permitted participant or designated organisation bodies. Effectively, if campaigners, if people who are part of an organised campaign are using social media to campaign, I think there is a reasonable expectation that they do the same thing in terms of providing information about who they are and who's publishing material, as they would if they were putting flyers up around their community. People don't always do that. People don't always obey the law when they're printing material, but they're supposed to. And I think we should have that same level of requirement. My amendments would not apply to individuals who are unconnected with campaign bodies, merely using social media to discuss the issues. I think that still requires some further consideration in future, but this amendment doesn't include individuals who are purely using social media or online publication to discuss the issues, but it would apply to those who are connected to campaign bodies and who are publishing on social media. It would also apply to those who set up standalone campaign websites, for example, which are not part of a social media platform. As I say, I do move Amendment 83, but I do that in the hope that whatever happens with any of the amendments in this group, we will continue to be open to debating, refining and improving the way in which we regulate campaigning in the online space, because I don't think any of us, the government or myself, would claim that what we have in front of us can be the final word on that issue.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 35 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. Patrick Hardy has set out his case well. I very much respect where he's coming from, and I think we both accept that this is a difficult area which we're all trying to get right, and it's an issue that's being dealt with by every democracy. So we are moving into unknown territory, and we're trying to make sure that we continue to regulate electoral activities in the best and most even-handed way possible, but recognising that there are new problems occurring every day. Let me first deal with Government Amendments 35, 36 and 38, which relate to the requirement that referendum material must have an imprint to show who is promoting and who is publishing the material. In its report at Stage 1, the committee recommended that the Scottish Government gives careful consideration to recommendations of the Electoral Commission in relation to the scope of the imprint requirement. The Scottish Government's policy intention for online materials has always been to cover campaign material rather than individual views, and that's an important distinction. I think all parties recognise it's important for democratic debate that voters are able to express and discuss their viewpoints on the issues raised by a referendum, and that campaign materials are clearly labelled and identifiable. And the discussions we've had with the Electoral Commission have been around how best to achieve this. We've been working closely with the Electoral Commission for some time, with the aim of ensuring that an individual who is not working on behalf of a campaigning organisation and who is not paying commercially to promote their message will be able to freely share their views online without having to add an imprint. And together we've looked at how other governments have dealt with these similar issues in their responses, particularly the Canadian provisions on exemption of personal views. Amendment 35 is a result of our deliberations, and it will exempt any material which expresses the individual's personal opinion and is published on the individual's own behalf on a non-commercial basis from the requirement to include an imprint. This amendment would ensure that an individual discussing their individual views with friends or strangers online does not have to add an imprint. However, an individual who decides to pass on campaign literature relating to the referendum, unless it is being used to illustrate a particular point of view, must add an imprint, as they will have moved, of course. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Could the Cabinet Secretary confirm precisely what he means in that last point about passing on material which has been produced by a campaign body. If, for example, a graphic was produced by a campaign body which was being passed on without an imprint, and an individual chose to post, for example, a tweet that includes their own personal opinion in the text and then the graphic from a campaign body, it seems to me that that would be exempted because the publication is the tweet. The publication would be expressing the individual's personal opinion, and the publication would be published on the individual's own behalf on a non-commercial basis. It seems to me that that opens up a route for a campaign body which wishes to hide the true origin of its publications to allow others to promote and boost their material without any kind of transparency information being attached.
Well, it should not do so, but if you were to err in the other direction and to say that nobody could pass on a piece of campaign material which they wish to comment on, as people do in social media, without in actual fact saying that they are part of that campaign or need to identify themselves as part of that campaign, that would be going very far into the restriction of individual liberty. It is going to be a fluid area. But I think you would want to err on the side of individuals being able to express their opinion and to illustrate that opinion, which is something that is the common parlance and grammar of social media. So the imprint would have to be added if they were part of a campaign organisation. And similarly, any individual who is sponsored or supported by an organisation will not be allowed to publish material without an imprint as due to that sponsorship. And there is a slight parallel here in terms of advertising rules and the way in which people move from being individuals to being essentially influencers, and how you draw that line. And that line is a difficult line to draw, but it is being drawn in the commercial sphere. In addition, any individual who is also a registered campaigner or who spent money to create campaign materials will be required to include an imprint. Now, the Electoral Commission are broadly content that the proposed amendments will provide clarity around who will be required to provide an imprint, and will address concerns around unregulated campaigning. Of course, we'll continue to discuss this with the Commission and with you, Mr Harvey, and with others, and may bring forward further refinements to the provisions at Stage 3. As part of these changes, related Amendment 36 removes the reasonably practical exemption currently in the bill. The Committee's Stage 1 report supported the recommendation of the Electoral Commission that the bill is amended to remove, unless it is not reasonably practical to do so, from the requirement to include an imprint. The Electoral Commission had expressed concerns that if the reasonable practical exemption were retained, it would hamper their work with social media companies on technical solutions to online imprints. Social media companies might use such an exemption as a defence for not bringing forward a technical solution. I'm happy to accept the recommendation in the light of Amendment 35, the personal opinion exemption, and Amendment 36 would remove the reasonably practical exemption. Amendment 38 simply makes clear that the use of the term address requires to be provided in the imprint means a physical postal address, not an email address. This is the position taken for printed material at other elections and for the 2014 referendum for online materials. Yes, if I'm conscious of time.
Very quickly intervention.
I'm grateful. Just on the point of postal addresses, I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can confirm that doesn't necessarily mean the individual's domestic residential address. It could be the postal address of an organisation they're involved with.
It must be addressed which is accessible and available, and contacting which would be the equivalent of contacting the individual.
Thank you.
So there is a slight grey area in there.
That's helpful, thank you.
So the request of the Electoral Commission, I brought forward this amendment which clarifies that a postal address is required. That identifies those involved by linking them to a physical location rather than an email address which could be anywhere in the world. And taken together, these three amendments will help to strengthen the rules around online campaigning. However, I'm well aware this is an evolving area. And whilst I share Mr Harvey's concerns, I have difficulties with his particular amendments. I want to offer to continue to work with Mr Harvey to try and get these into a place where I feel it is safe to support them. As the amendments capture social media material, a redesigned version could possibly work alongside our government amendments that apply to a wider range of non-printed material. It might be possible to capture material from all registered permitted participants and relevant donors to those campaigns. but there are legal difficulties applying controls to any registered party member and any party donor, as Amendment 84 subsection 7BB would do. The Scotland Act reserves the registration and funding of political parties, and that is a difficulty here. I'm happy to commit myself to discuss with Mr Harvey how we might move on from that to see if we could get a legally operable a series of amendments. I would add that the Scottish Government's proposed change to make the offence of not providing an imprint triable also by solemn procedure with a jury, with an intended increase in the penalties attached to the offence, taken together with the increased civil penalties, civil sanction powers of the Electoral Commission, should significantly add to the deterrent for campaigners who breach imprint rules, but without deterring individuals from participating. And that is the balance that has to be struck. These are important measures. I would ask Mr Harvey not to press his amendments, to hope that we can find a better solution to what he wishes by stage 3, but I commend my amendments to the committee.
Okay, any other member want to take here? No other member. Patrick Harvey, to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 83 then, please.
Thank you, Convener. I realise I should have noted Amendment 36 in my opening remarks. I welcome the Government's decision to lodge an amendment to remove the unless not reasonably practicable exemption. If the Government hadn't, I would have, because it's something the committee agreed to, but I'm very grateful that the Cabinet Secretary has brought that amendment. Without wanting to go over again ground that we've touched on, I think one of the issues which I think the Cabinet Secretary's remarks again don't quite engage with is how we distinguish between those who are active campaigners and publishing on social media in their capacity as individuals, where the line is between that and their identity as a campaigner. If an individual, for example, who is very wealthy and who is personally funding a campaign body, use their individual social media accounts, perhaps in relation to information that they've gained through being a campaigner, in order to target those social media posts, there is a grey area there again, and I fear that the Government's approach would exempt publications which are carried out in that way, which I think a common sense approach, if we could achieve it, would say should be regulated. Again, I'm not going to pretend that any of us have this at a state of perfection, but I would like to press Amendment 83 just in order to gauge what level of support, if any, exists for it. And even if it's voted down, I hope the Government will still be willing to discuss with me alternative approaches for stage 3. Press 83.
Okay, thank you. The question, therefore, is that Amendment 83 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay, then there will be a division. All those in favour, please show. All those against? Those who wish to abstain? There were 3 votes for, 5 against, 3 abstentions, and therefore the amendment is not agreed to. I now call Amendment 35 and name the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 83. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, there will be a division. Those who are in favour, please show. Those who are against. Those who wish to abstain. Ten votes for, 1 against. The amendment is therefore agreed to. I now call Amendment 36 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 83. Cabinet Secretary to move formally. The question is that Amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 84 in the name of Patrick Harvey, already debated with Amendment 83. Patrick Harvey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I now call Amendment 37 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 30. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 38 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 83. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is Amendment 38 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I propose to take a 5-minute break, so I suspend at this stage. Thank you. Okay. Okay, colleagues, I now call Amendment 39 in name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 40, 41, 46, 47 and 48. I'd ask the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 39 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, I'm conscious of time, so I'll be as brief as I can. The committee asked me, the Scottish Government, to explain in more detail why the proposed reporting requirements for referendums are different than requirements in general elections when weekly reports are required. I have looked at this matter and talked to the Electoral Commission about it. We've agreed that a move to weekly reporting could be to the detriment of smaller campaigners. Imposing the weekly reporting requirements to apply to political parties would add an additional burden to smaller campaigners. Political parties and most third-party campaigners are used to having to report weekly. However, some may not be used to it. Having heard the Commission's concerns and the advice that the 4-week reporting period in the 2014 referendum worked well, I'm not convinced that moving to weekly reporting period for donations and transactions is in the best interests of an inclusive referendum. I'm therefore not proposing to introduce a weekly reporting requirement. However, with the move to a default referendum period of 10 weeks, as proposed and agreed earlier, then there does need to be a move in terms of more frequent reporting. The amendments require that where the 10-week referendum period applies, it should be split into 3 reporting periods. The first period would start on the first day of the referendum period and end after 2 weeks. A second 4-week period would run, and then a final 4-week period would run. Now, that timing would work for a default 4-week referendum period. If it were to be changed by legislation providing for a particular referendum, then revised reporting periods would be required as a consequential amendment, but the principle would apply that the 4-week periods would be the default.
Does anyone wish to contribute at this stage? Okay, no one else to distribute. I'm assuming you don't need to wind up, but you need to tell me where you're pressing the withdrawal.
Press the amendment.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 39 be agreed or well agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I now call Amendments 40 to 52, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, all previously debated. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 40 to 52 en bloc.
Move en bloc.
Does the member object to a single question being put on Amendments 40 to 52? No member objects. The question is that Amendments 40 to 52 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay. The question is that Schedule 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. The question is that Section 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 35 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with the... Sorry, 53. In the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with Amendments 54, 55, 56 and 57. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 53 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, there was concern that the Bill's provisions limit the Commission's initial monitoring powers to gather information. The Electoral Commission asked that its power to obtain information outside an investigation be strengthened to enable the Commission to deal with more compliance issues in real time ahead of a referendum, which would strengthen compliance with and trust in the campaign rules. The Commission is currently able to monitor activity by issuing disclosure notices, but they cannot require information from other persons unless they use their warrant powers. The threshold for that is reasonable grounds to suspect that a campaign offence has been committed. This restricts the ability of the Commission to respond rapidly to emerging situations and to provide appropriate and timely advice and interventions. It would be in everyone's interest if potential compliance issues could be addressed at an earlier stage. As well as requesting a broadening of the categories of the organisation and individual, the Commission raised concerns about the scope of the disclosure order power, which is confined to material about spending. This does not cover the full range of situations, for example, about imprints. Amendment 57 therefore proposes to expand the subjects which monitoring can be undertaken to include material reasonably required of a wider range of persons in relation to a wider range of the Commission's campaign enforcement responsibilities. It is necessary to take a proportionate approach, but it will give the Commission flexibility to respond. And therefore bringing forward these amendments which will allow disclosure notice to be given to individuals and bodies who are not registered as permitted participants under the rules if the Commission has reasonable grounds for believing they should be permitted participants. And the aim is to investigate where it appears to the Commission an individual or body is incurring referendum expenses that take them above the expenses limit. These amendments will, amongst others, help to identify individuals or bodies who have made a declaration as a permitted participant, but where there are questions whether they are qualifying individuals or bodies, for example, if they weren't based in the UK, individuals or bodies where there's a reasonable belief that they have received a relevant donation or entered into a regulated transaction under the campaign rules when they were not entitled to do so, and individuals or bodies who supply services or goods to campaigners, including those who may have published, printed or promoted material subject to the imprint rules, which require identity and address to be shown. This will allow the Commission to confirm who has requested and benefited from services or good. These amendments significantly strengthen the Electoral Commission's powers to gather information which could lead to a formal investigation and to ensure that investigations can be carried out timorously.
Anyone want to contribute? In that case, no other member wishes to contribute. The question is that Amendment 53 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Amendments 54 to 59, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 54 to 59 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Does a member object to a single question being put on Amendments 54 to 59? No one objects, so I put the question. No one objects, so the question is that Amendment 54 to 59 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Schedule 4 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Call Amendment 60 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. All debated with Amendment 30. Cabinet Secretary move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 60 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. I call Amendment 61 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 76. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 61 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. The question is that Schedule 5 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 15 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 62 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 30. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 62 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 63 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 30. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 63 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. The question is that Sections 17 and 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 64 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated Amendment 5. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 64 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We're agreed. The question is that Section 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Sections 20 to 23 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. I now call Amendment 65 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated Amendment 5. Cabinet Secretary move formally.
Moved.
The question is that 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. The question is that Section 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I now call Amendment 106 in the name of James Kelly with Amendment 66. James Kelly to move Amendment 106 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Briefly, because I realise we're pressed for time. Amendment 106 again seeks to increase voter awareness and voter turnout. It does so through empowering public authorities to do all that they can to support voter registration, to increase voter awareness of methods of voting, and to take any other relevant action. I think Amendment 66 is of a similar vein, empowering registration officers to take appropriate steps to increase voter awareness and voter turnout. And I would support 66 as well as my own amendment of 106.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald to speak to Amendment 66.
Convener, I've brought forward Amendment 66 to ensure that electoral registration officers are clear about their role in promoting participation in the run-up to a referendum. We heard evidence at stage 1 calling for this to be clarified. I want to see as many people as possible engage at any future referendum, no matter what the topic is. We've spoken before during stage 1 about increasing registration numbers and turnout amongst young people and other groups statistically less likely to engage in politics and to exercise their right to vote. I've already commented on the importance of reaching these groups in order to ensure everyone is able to make their voices heard. My intention is that by making it clear that EROs have a specific duty to promote participation, will help to encourage more people from these groups to register to vote and engage politics going forward.
Any other members wish to contribute? Patrick.
Thank you. Very briefly, I welcome both of these amendments. I think we should all be looking to see that public bodies do take steps to encourage voter participation and understanding of any referendums that take place. It may be that the government might feel that Amendment 106 is too broad, but I think given that it begins by saying public authorities must take steps, such steps as it considers appropriate, I think that's quite reasonable. There'll be some public authorities for whom very few or minimal activity would be appropriate, and I think that's quite reasonable. But I do think that Amendment 106 gets closer to, for example, ensuring that local authorities in their educational functions take the responsibility to increase voter turnout and participation in referendums. I think that's very good. We saw some excellent practice in 2014 and some very poor practice. And I would like to hope that we would all want to see any future referendum spreading the best practice everywhere. 106, it seems to me, is more likely to help achieve that.
Alec Rowley?
Yeah, I'd speak in favour of both 106 and 56 as well. And I think it's a point that Patrick makes where there is good practice out there. There's good practice out there in local authorities in terms of encouraging voter registration, but that good practice isn't necessarily shared across the country. And I think, I mean, even in Edinburgh this last few weeks, I've noticed that there's a lot of advertising on lampposts and that telling people to sign up to vote. Which is good practice, but we need to encourage more of that. So I think it's right that these amendments are here today, and I'll support them.
Neil, anyone want to speak? No. Therefore, Cabinet Secretary.
I encourage members to support Amendment 66. I think it is very important that the Electoral Registration Officer's clear role is recognised and built on, so that they are empowered to do the job that needs to be done, and I don't disagree that the job needs to be done. In terms of 106, I'm happy to discuss with Mr Kelly a focusing of this amendment to where the responsibility lies. Counting officers, the Electoral Commission and local authorities already have an obligation to promote registration and participation. Mr Rowley has indicated some are doing very well, some are not doing as well. We need to focus on that activity, but the amendment is drawn it far too wide. It lays an obligation upon others, Caledonian MacBrayne, the National Galleries and the Royal Botanic Gardens. Now, whatever your definition is, this would not necessarily be the right bodies to lay it upon. So I am very happy, and I listened to Mr Harvey, to take this away, to work with Mr Kelly to try and focus this amendment. Well, if I have to, yes.
I just want to see if I understood the force of the Cabinet Secretary's objection to the breadth of Mr Kelly's amendment. I mean, because, as Mr Rowley said, that it provides in terms that Scottish public authorities must take such steps as they consider appropriate. Now, the examples that he's given, I mean, I don't think any of us would think that it was appropriate for CalMac to spend a great deal of its resource promoting registration to vote, although the occasional poster on a ferry probably wouldn't do any harm. So I don't understand the point that this, as drafted, this amendment is overly broad.
I don't think that those bodies need to consider this. I mean, I think that the issue is who should consider this and who should work on it. Those bodies don't need to consider this, but other bodies do need to consider this. Now, I am absolutely in favour of them considering it. There are obligations upon public authorities, in any case, the relevant public authorities. So what I'm saying, I think very reasonably, is if Mr Kelly wants to not move this, I will work with Mr Kelly to try and get this into a form that is in the bill at the final stage, that is agreed at stage 3, and we can focus attention on the right bodies.
Did you wish to add anything else? That was the intervention. Anything else you want to
That's
say,
it.
Cabinet Secretary? James Kelly, to wind up and press a withdraw Amendment 106, please.
Thank people for their constructive comments. I think Patrick Harvey and Alec Rowley made good points in relation to it's important that we get consistent practice across the country, and this amendment seeks to achieve that. I think on balance, what I would prefer to do is actually move the amendment and seek to include it. I think it is worded in such a way by saying that it's where appropriate, that it allows, where appropriate, public authorities not to take action where it would be deemed inappropriate. So I think I think that is legitimate.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. Therefore, the question is that Amendment 106 be agreed to or will agreed.
Yes.
There will be a division in that case. All those in favour, please show. All those against. There were 6 votes for, there were 5 against. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The question is that section 25 be agreed to or will agreed. Yes. We're agreed. The question is that section 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. I call Amendment 107 in the name of James Kelly in a group on its own. James Kelly to move and to speak to Amendment 107, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'm not going to move this amendment. I listened very carefully to the debate that took place earlier. I think the starting position in relation to this legislation was that the government sought to impose the wording from the previous 2014 independence referendum in regard to any future referendum and sideline the role of the Electoral Commission. Sensibly, the Cabinet Secretary has looked at the committee report and listened to the recommendations. I note that discussions with the Electoral Commission are ongoing. It seems to me that that's still work in progress, and a resolution hasn't been reached at this point, which gives adequate weight to the role of the Electoral Commission. However, I'm prepared to allow those discussions to continue ahead of stage 3 and reserve the right to bring the amendment back then.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. Just for clarity then, 107 has not been moved. The question therefore is that section 27 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. I call Amendment 66 in the name of Gordon MacDonald, already debated with Amendment 106. Gordon MacDonald to move or not move? Move. The question is that Amendment 66 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. The question is that that section 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Now call Amendment 108 in the name of James Kelly, group with Amendment 109. James Kelly to move Amendment 108 and speak to both amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. Again, briefly, both of these amendments seek to when the report on the conduct of the election takes place is to give appropriate weight to the role of the Commission for Equality and Human Rights. I think that body has a key role to play in terms of ensuring that all groups within society have appropriate participation in elections, and that their role is given respect. So I think it's important that they are consulted on and are given regard to their findings in terms of when the report into the electoral conduct takes place.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. Anybody else wish to contribute? Mr Patrick Carvey, please.
Thanks again. Very briefly, I'm very open to this amendment. I would ask James Kelly in his winding up to explain why he felt that only the Commission on Equality and Human Rights should be included in this amendment, rather than, for example, the Commission on Children and Young People, the Commissioner for Children and Young People, or other bodies who represent specific groups. I think that the ethos of it is very good, and I would like to see us include something along these lines in the bill, but I'm unclear why it's been drawn only in reference to that one particular body.
Anybody else wish to contribute? Cabinet Secretary.
The point Mr Harvey made is the key point. I understand the Electoral Commission is more than willing to consult with many bodies and does consult with many bodies. But I don't think anybody would be in favour of a prescription that it should be consult with singly with this body alone, or even that this body should be preferred out of other bodies. I think the position here is that if there's an encouragement to the Electoral Commission to consult with more bodies, then that is a discussion we should have with the Electoral Commission, rather than simply prescribe it here and now. They are also, can I just finish, please? And they could therefore decide to do so. I understand that they've not shown themselves in favour of this, but I'm not against their consulting, quite the reverse. I want them to consult with as many people as possible.
Could I ask, would you agree that there should be something in the bill that requires the Electoral Commission to consult as widely with these bodies?
I would have no objection if Mr Kelly had something in here that would say that the Electoral Commission would be expected to or required to consult with a range of bodies. But Mr Harvey has been correct here. You know, there are a range of other bodies, but it also is something that they are already doing. And they make the point that they want their reports to be such as, you know, are comprehensive but not overwhelming. So if they spend lots of time consulting with lots of people and have to quote them, then they're not sure they wish to do that. But I'm very happy to have an amendment that actually says the Commission should consult widely, but it is happening. And they assure us that it is happening and that that's what they do.
Do you want to add anything else, Mr Russell?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. James Kelly, to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 108, please.
Okay, I think having listened to the contributions, I think Patrick Harvey makes relevant points in relation to the other bodies. I think the key thing is that the Electoral Commission must give regard to consulting appropriately, and I think that should be in the legislation. I take the point that that needs to be worded correctly, and what I'll do is I'll not press this amendment, but I'll reconsider it in terms of stage 3.
Thank you very much. In which case, does any member object to this amendment being withdrawn? No member objects. Now call Amendment 109, named James Kelly, already debated with Amendment 108. James Kelly, to move or not move?
Not move.
Not moved. The question is that Section 29 be agreed to, or will agreed? We are agreed. You'll be glad to know, I think I'm going to make this next grouping, the final grouping this morning, because otherwise we might be until long debate in the next area anyway. So I call Amendment 67 the name of Angela Constance, group with Amendment 68 and 69. Angela Constance to move Amendment 67 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. Colleagues will recall that in our Stage 1 report, committee supported the Scottish Parliament corporate body recommendation that the bill should be amended to provide for SPCB funding of the Electoral Commission's expenditure to be in line with the corporate body's duties for the other independent bodies' funds. So I've brought forward amendments 67 to 69. Amendment 67 ensures it is clear the Commission can only be reimbursed for expenditure properly incurred, and reimbursement for expenditure which does not relate to the Commission's functions under the Act can be refused. Amendment 68 more clearly limits the amount the Commission can be reimbursed to the estimate previously agreed by the corporate body. This ensures both the Commission and the Parliament corporate body know the maximum amount the Commission has to spend on its functions under the Act. However, as I'm sure colleagues will appreciate, estimating costs is not always an exact science, and unexpected costs can arise. Therefore, this proposed amendment allows the corporate body to reimburse expenditure by the Commission which exceeds their agreed estimate, should it deem that appropriate. The corporate body will of course be able to draw down funds to cover the Electoral Commission's expenditure in the same way as for its other expenditure. Amendment 69 is consequential on Amendment 68 to ensure the cost of the Electoral Commission's activities under this Act should not be met from funds provided by the Speaker's Committee of the UK Parliament. As I understand it, the ongoing funding arrangements between the corporate body and the Commission are the subject of further discussion in connection with the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. It may therefore be useful or appropriate, depending on what the Parliament approves on that bill, to amend these arrangements at some point in the future. And I'm assured that the Scottish Government will look to do this using the powers in Section 37 of this Act.
Do any other member wish to contribute? No other member wishes to contribute. Cabinet Secretary.
I'd like to thank the corporate body and Angela Constance for raising the issue. The Scottish Government is committed to funding the costs of referendums held under this bill. We've been engaging with the Scottish Parliament corporate body and the Commission to agree how this and day-to-day expenditure associated with devolved elections should be taken forward. I understand this approach has the support of both the Scottish Parliament corporate body and the Electoral Commission. As Angela Constance has mentioned, we may have to use Section 37 after the Reform Bill has been passed. This is dependent upon the funding arrangements for the Electoral Commission, which are contained in the Scottish Elections Reform Bill and are still subject to the final agreement of the Parliament. As are all those concerned are content with these suggestions, I urge the committee to support the arrangements.
Okay, Angela Constance, do you wish to press or withdraw your Amendment 67?
Press.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 67 be agreed to or all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Call Amendment 68, name of Angela Constance, already debated Amendment 67. Angela Constance, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 68 be agreed or all agreed? Yes. Thank you. We're agreed. Call Amendment 69, name Angela Constance, already debated with Amendment 67. Angela Constance, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 69 be agreed to or all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 30 be agreed or we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Sections 31 to 35 be agreed or we all agreed? Yes. Thank you, colleagues. As we'll not complete consideration of the bill today at this meeting, the committee will continue consideration at its next meeting on the 4th of December. I therefore thank members and the Cabinet Secretary for their participation in this morning's proceedings, and I close the meeting. Thank you.